My ex-husband stood in family court wearing a bespoke Italian suit, wiping away perfectly timed crocodile tears as he told the judge that our son was begging to live with him. He claimed I was bankrupt, mentally unstable, and completely unfit to be a mother. But when the judge turned to my 11-year-old boy and asked if that was true, my son did not cry or cower. He simply stood up, pulled his phone from his pocket, and pressed play on a secret recording from the night before. What echoed through that silent courtroom made the judge freeze completely and wiped the arrogant smirk right off my ex-husband's face. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last 3 years letting my ex-husband believe he had completely destroyed me. I work as an interior stager, or at least that is what I let his wealthy family believe. The mahogany walls of the family courthouse felt cold and imposing that Tuesday morning. I sat at the defendant table, my hands neatly folded in my lap, wearing a simple beige blouse and slacks. Across the aisle at the plaintiff table sat Bradley, my 36-year-old ex-husband, looking like a magazine cover in his dark navy suit. Beside him sat his new wife Sienna, 28 years old, and dressed in a tailored white dress that screamed old money, even though she was just an internet influencer who married into his family wealth. Judge Ramirez, a 60-year-old woman with a reputation for being completely merciless to liars, peered over her glasses at the paperwork in front of her. "Your Honor." Bradley said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I take no pleasure in being here today, but I have to protect my son. Natalie is completely broke. She hops from cheap apartment to cheap apartment, struggling to find gig work arranging furniture. She is mentally unstable, erratic, and deeply depressed. Just last night, Leo called me in tears. He begged me to save him. He wants to live with Sienna and me permanently." Sienna reached over and placed a manicured hand on Bradley's shoulder, offering the judge a look of deep maternal sorrow. "We just want to give the boy a stable, loving home." "Your Honor," she whispered loud enough for the court reporter to catch. "He needs a real mother figure." I did not react. I did not scream or call them liars. I just kept my eyes fixed on my son Leo, who was sitting quietly next to my lawyer. Leo was 11, going on 30, a quiet, observant boy who had seen far too much of his father's cruelty behind closed doors. Judge Ramirez sighed heavily, looking at me with a mixture of pity and sternness. "Ms. Natalie, these are very serious allegations. If you cannot provide proof of stable income and housing today, I will have no choice but to grant emergency temporary custody to the father. But before we get to the financial disclosures, I want to hear from the child." The judge softened her tone and leaned forward. "Leo, sweetheart, you do not have to be afraid. Did you tell your father you want to live with him? Is your mother unable to take care of you?" Bradley turned to look at Leo, giving him a sharp warning glare. It was the same look he used to give me when we were married, the look that meant I would pay for it later if I stepped out of line. Leo stood up. He was wearing his favorite green sweater, looking so small in that massive courtroom, but his eyes were completely steady. "No, Your Honor," Leo said clearly. "I never said that." "My dad is lying." Bradley shot out of his chair. "Your Honor, the boy is clearly manipulated. Natalie has brainwashed him." "Sit down, Mr. Bradley." Judge Ramirez snapped her gavel, hitting the sounding block with a sharp crack. "Let the boy speak." Leo slowly tapped his small smartphone screen. Bradley's arrogant, confident smirk vanished instantly. The audio was slightly muffled but undeniably clear. My ex-husband's harsh, aggressive voice filled the massive courtroom. "Tomorrow, you tell the judge you hate your mother, or I call the bank and have her evicted from that trashy apartment. I will make sure she starves out on the street. You will tell them she is crazy, or I swear to God, I will cut off your health insurance, and you can both rot. Do you understand me? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The absolute silence in the courtroom lasted for only a few seconds before Bradley's attorney, a man whose custom-tailored suit likely cost more than my first vehicle, cleared his throat loudly. He did not look rattled in the slightest. Instead, he let out a loud, patronizing chuckle that echoed off the high mahogany walls. He unbuttoned his jacket and stepped casually toward the center of the room, shaking his head as if he had just witnessed a child performing a cheap magic trick. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of erratic, highly disturbing behavior my client was warning you about, he said, gesturing dismissively toward Leo and me. What we just heard on that phone is nothing more than a desperate fabrication. It is an AI deepfake created by a bitter woman who refuses to accept reality and let go of her wealthy ex-husband. The attorney then paced directly in front of our table, pointing an accusing finger right at my face. My client is a respected tech entrepreneur. He does not threaten children. The mother, however, is currently unemployed. She claims to be a freelance interior stager, but we have pulled her public records, and she has not had a single verified client in over 6 months. She sits in her rented low-income apartment playing on her computer manufacturing fake digital audio clips to extort my client. It is a pathetic, terrifying attempt to weaponize her own child because she knows she cannot provide for him financially or emotionally. Before Judge Ramirez could even process the lawyer's bold claim, Sienna sprang from her chair like an actress stepping onto a stage. She clasped her diamond ring-covered hands over her chest, her face twisted into a flawless mask of pure agony. "Your Honor, please," she cried out, her voice breaking perfectly. "I cannot sleep at night worrying about this sweet boy. We did not want to air her dirty laundry in public, but she forced our hand. We have proof. We have absolute, undeniable proof of her constant negligence." Sienna grabbed a thick, heavy manila envelope from the plaintiff table and rushed frantically toward the bench. The court bailiff immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but the judge waved him off, allowing Sienna to approach. With a highly dramatic flourish, Sienna dumped a massive stack of glossy 8x10 photographs directly in front of the judge. "Look at these," Sienna sobbed, wiping a completely dry eye and looking back at the gallery to make sure everyone was watching her performance. "Look at how she treats her own son." I craned my neck slightly to see the images scattered across the polished wood. They were completely fabricated. They were heavily manipulated pictures showing a woman who looked vaguely like me stumbling out of a filthy dive bar at 2 in the morning. Another photo showed my current apartment building with a digital timestamp of midnight, claiming I had left Leo completely alone in a dangerous neighborhood while I went out partying with strangers. The Photoshop work was decent enough to fool an untrained eye at first glance, making me look like a disheveled, reckless mess. We hired a private investigator. Sienna lied smoothly, returning to Bradley's side and grabbing his arm for emotional support. "He took these last week. She leaves Leo completely unattended in that tiny roach-infested apartment. She spends whatever meager child support Bradley gives her on alcohol and nightlife. She is an unfit mother, Your Honor. Leo deserves our sprawling estate where he has his own private bedroom, a personal tutor and a mother figure who actually stays home to care for him properly." Bradley nodded gravely, acting the part of the deeply concerned wealthy father to absolute perfection. "I just want my son safe." "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with fake paternal emotion. "She is highly unstable. I am offering him a life of immense privilege, absolute security, and endless love. She is offering him a life of crushing poverty and dangerous neglect. You have to grant me emergency physical custody right now today before she does something drastic that gets my boy hurt." Judge Ramirez slowly picked up the scattered photographs. Her expression, which had softened briefly when Leo played his recording, now hardened into solid granite. She scrutinized the glossy images, her jaw clenching tight. Family court judges deal with terrible, tragic situations every single day, and the mere suggestion of child abandonment was enough to make her blood run cold. She meticulously placed the photos down in a neat stack and locked her piercing brown eyes right on me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Miss Natalie Judge Ramirez," said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous heavy weight. The Family Court of New York does not take allegations of child abandonment lightly, nor do we look kindly upon the manufacturing of digital evidence to manipulate custody proceedings. Your ex-husband and his wife have presented documented claims regarding your highly questionable lifestyle and your complete financial ruin. They have painted a picture of a mother who cannot even keep the lights on, let alone raise a child in a safe, healthy environment. The judge leaned forward, folding her hands tightly together, resting them on the towering wooden desk. I am giving you exactly one opportunity to respond to these severe allegations. I want immediate documented proof of your current employment. I want certified tax returns, recent bank statements, and irrefutable proof of a safe living environment. If you cannot produce undeniable hard evidence of your financial stability right here and right now, I will sign the emergency order handing full custody to the father before you can even walk out of those double doors. Do you understand me? My court-appointed lawyer shifted nervously in his seat, instantly reaching for his beat-up briefcase with shaking hands. But I placed a calm, steady hand on his wrist, stopping him from digging around. I did not panic. I did not scream that the photos were fake or that Sienna was a pathological liar. I simply looked across the aisle at Bradley, who was currently fighting back a massive, victorious grin. He genuinely thought he had me backed into a corner. He truly believed his family money, his expensive lawyer, and a few fake pictures were finally enough to break my spirit and steal my child. I turned my gaze back to the stern face of the judge. The crushing pressure of the courtroom, the severe threat of losing my son, the vicious, coordinated lies, none of it fazed me in the slightest. I casually reached into my designer leather tote bag, a bag Bradley always assumed was a cheap flea market knockoff, and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed corporate folder. I looked right at my ex-husband and let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. It was the exact kind of calm, terrifying smile that made Bradley's victorious grin instantly vanish from his face. Your Honor. Before I show you the contents of this folder, I need to explain exactly why my ex-husband rushed into this courtroom today, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Because this entire charade was not born out of a sudden concern for my son. It was carefully orchestrated exactly 72 hours ago on Thanksgiving evening. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his eyes darting toward his lawyer. The judge folded her hands and nodded, instructing me to continue. 72 hours earlier, I had driven Leo out to Bradley's sprawling family estate to drop him off for the holiday weekend. It was a massive, cold monstrosity of stone and glass, hidden behind towering iron gates. I pulled my modest sedan up the winding driveway, parking behind a line of expensive imported sports cars. Leo sat in the passenger seat, clutching his overnight bag, looking absolutely terrified to go inside. I kissed his forehead and promised him I would pick him up on Sunday. I walked him up the grand, sweeping stone steps, but before I could even ring the bell, the heavy mahogany front door swung open. It was not Bradley waiting to greet his son. It was his older sister, Caroline. She stood there wearing a designer silk dress, holding a crystal glass of expensive wine, looking down her nose at me the way she always did. She physically blocked the grand entryway, refusing to let me step even 1 foot inside the house. "Do not bother cutting your engine, Natalie," Caroline sneered, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Just drop the boy and get off the property. We have guests arriving, and we do not want them seeing the hired help lingering in the driveway." I ignored her pathetic insult and gently pushed Leo forward. "Have a good weekend, buddy," I whispered. As Leo slipped past her into the house, Caroline suddenly stepped forward and violently shoved a thick, heavy manila envelope directly into my chest. I reflexively grabbed it to stop it from hitting the ground. I looked down at the bold black lettering stamped across the top. It was an emergency custody petition. "We have tolerated your trashy upbringing and your embarrassing poverty for far too long." "Natalie," Caroline hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. 10 years ago, you trapped my brother to get a piece of our family money. But now he has Sienna. He has a proper wife who comes from a proper background. You are nothing but a broke freelance nobody who cannot even pay her own rent. We are taking the boy permanently. You have until Tuesday to say goodbye." I stood there on the cold stone porch holding the thick stack of legal threats. I looked past Caroline's shoulder into the grand marble foyer. Standing in the background near the grand staircase was Caroline's husband Terrence. He is a tall, distinguished African-American man who works as a highly respected corporate consultant. Over the years, I had always noticed that Terrence carried a quiet, heavy dignity that completely contrasted with the vile, toxic nature of his wife's family. Terrence stood perfectly still, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle feathering in his cheek. He was watching his wife verbally assault me in my own son's presence. He did not say a single word. He did not intervene. But his dark eyes were locked onto mine, and the absolute disgust radiating from his face was impossible to miss. He hated this family just as much as I did. Caroline let out a cruel, condescending laugh, expecting me to break down crying right there on her doorstep. She expected me to fall to my knees and beg her to reconsider. She expected me to act like the weak, defeated woman they had always accused me of being. Instead, I slowly folded the heavy legal document perfectly in half. I looked up and met Caroline's smug, triumphant gaze. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show even an ounce of fear. "You really should not play games you cannot afford to finish, Caroline," I told her, my voice completely dead and flat. "Arrogance is a very expensive luxury, and your family is completely out of credit." I turned my back on her, leaving her standing on the porch with a confused frown forming on her perfectly powdered face. I walked calmly down the steps, got into my car, and drove away into the cold November night, knowing exactly what I was going to do next. I brought my focus back to the present moment inside the courtroom. I looked right at Judge Ramirez and placed my hands firmly on the heavy corporate folder I had just pulled from my bag. "They ambushed me on Thanksgiving, Your Honor," I stated firmly. "They handed me those fake custody papers and threatened to bury me in legal fees because they genuinely believed I was just a struggling interior stager. They believed they could crush me with their wealth." I opened the folder. But what Bradley and his family do not know is that I do not arrange furniture for a living, and I am far from broke. Before I hand these financial documents to the bailiff, I told the judge, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "There is one more crucial detail about that Thanksgiving night you need to understand." Because while Caroline was busy threatening me on the front porch, she failed to notice what was happening right behind her. As I had turned to walk down the sweeping stone steps, I realized my gray wool scarf had slipped from my shoulder and fallen onto the frost-covered ground. I stopped and turned back to retrieve it. But the heavy mahogany front door opened again. It was not Caroline this time. It was Terrence. He stepped out into the freezing night air, leaving the warmth and the loud, arrogant laughter of his wife's family behind him. He picked up my scarf and walked slowly down the long driveway toward my parked car. The crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath his expensive leather shoes. When he reached me, he did not offer a fake holiday greeting or try to make excuses for his wife's vicious behavior. He simply handed me the scarf. His dark eyes held a profound weight, a mixture of exhaustion and silent solidarity. "They are going to play incredibly dirty," Terrence told me, his voice barely above a whisper, so his words would not carry back to the house. "Bradley is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things. Do not let them break you." I took the scarf and nodded. "I will not," I promised him. Terrence gave me a single firm nod of respect. It was the only moment of genuine human decency I had ever experienced on that property. He turned and walked back into the lion's den. But what happened next inside that house was something I only learned about later, when my brave 11-year-old son finally returned to me. According to Leo, the moment Terrence walked back inside the front door, Bradley finally made his grand appearance. He came marching down the grand sweeping staircase, but he did not rush to hug the son he claimed to love so desperately. He did not ask Leo how his car ride was or if he was excited for Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, Bradley marched straight up to his own child, grabbed him harshly by the upper arm, and dragged him away from the rest of the family. Bradley pulled Leo down a long, dimly lit hallway and shoved him inside his private mahogany-paneled study. It was a massive, intimidating room filled with expensive leather furniture and walls of unread books meant to make Bradley look like a scholar. Bradley slammed the heavy wooden door shut, cutting off all the noise from the holiday party outside. He wanted complete privacy. He wanted to make sure there were absolutely no witnesses to the psychological torture he was about to inflict on a child. But my son is incredibly smart. He has spent his entire childhood watching his father manipulate and gaslight everyone around him. Leo knew exactly what that cold look in his father's eyes meant. So as Bradley was busy turning the heavy brass lock on the study door, Leo slipped his small hand into the pocket of his jeans. With his heart pounding in his chest, he blindly swiped his thumb across his phone screen and pressed the record button on his audio application. He captured every single second of the nightmare that followed. Bradley loomed over our son, his face twisted with rage. He pointed a threatening finger right at Leo's chest and delivered the exact monologue the entire courtroom had just listened to. He told Leo that he had to stand in front of a judge and lie under oath. He threatened to call the bank and have me thrown out onto the street. He threatened to cancel Leo's health insurance. He promised to make us both starve if Leo did not follow his exact script. "Do we have an understanding, boy?" Bradley had hissed, his voice dripping with pure malice. Leo, terrified, but holding his ground, silently nodded his head. Satisfied that he had completely terrified a child into submission, Bradley unlocked the door and led him back to the dining room to eat turkey and pretend they were a picture-perfect family. The courtroom was dead silent as I finished recounting the events of that night. I looked away from the judge and locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. He was sinking lower into his expensive leather chair, his face pale and sweating. He knew the narrative was entirely slipping out of his control. "That is the man who claims he wants to provide a stable, loving home, Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "That is the man who accused me of being an unfit mother. But as you are about to see, the only thing Bradley is trying to protect today is his own fraudulent lifestyle." Before I could slide my corporate folder across the polished wood of the judge's bench, Bradley's high-priced attorney leaped out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor!" he practically shouted, waving his hands in the air to break the momentum I had just built. "The defendant is attempting to distract this court from the actual issue at hand by dragging us into a dramatic storytelling session about a holiday party. We are not here to discuss family disagreements. We are here to discuss the imminent danger to a child's physical and financial well-being." The attorney did not even wait for Judge Ramirez to rule on his outburst. He snatched a thick stapled packet from his leather briefcase and marched directly toward the bench. He moved with the desperate, aggressive energy of a man who is being paid an exorbitant amount of money to win at any cost. "Your Honor, I have right here a certified financial inquiry pulled just yesterday morning," the attorney declared, his voice booming with artificial authority. He slapped the packet down in front of the judge. "This court needs to look at the cold, hard facts. Natalie is not just struggling, she is completely drowning. She has defaulted on multiple high-interest loans and maxed out an endless string of credit cards, trying to keep her pathetic interior staging business afloat." My court-appointed lawyer shifted nervously again, practically sweating through his cheap suit. But I kept my eyes completely locked on Bradley's attorney, watching him perform his expensive theatrical routine. "According to these records, the mother is currently over $500,000 in debt," the attorney stated, emphasizing every single syllable for maximum dramatic effect. $500,000, Your Honor. These are not mere allegations. These are sworn statements from collection agencies. She has shell accounts, she has hidden penalties, and she is facing imminent litigation from 3 separate banks. Her rented apartment is 30 days away from being seized. She is backed into a terrifying financial corner, and that makes her incredibly dangerous. That is why she manufactured that fake audio recording of my client. She is trying to extort him to pay off her massive debts because she is a sinking ship. Judge Ramirez picked up the packet. Her thick silver eyebrows drew together in a tight, severe knot. I knew exactly what she was looking at, because I knew exactly how Bradley operated. He had paid someone a lot of money to forge those documents. He had taken the small business loan I had co-signed for him years ago during our marriage, the one he swore he had paid off, and manipulated the paperwork to make it look like I was the sole guarantor of a massive ballooning debt. The papers looked incredibly authentic, featuring official-looking bank logos, notarized stamps, and complex spreadsheets mapping out a fictional history of financial ruin. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Sienna let out a soft, theatrical gasp, covering her mouth in faked horror. "Oh my God," she whispered loudly enough for the gallery to hear. "That poor boy is living in absolute squalor." I turned my head slightly and looked at Bradley. He was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, looking completely relaxed. He caught my eye and offered a sickeningly triumphant smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the heavy oak table, and mouthed 3 words directly at me. "You are nothing." It was the same exact phrase he used to whisper to me in the dark when we were married. It was his favorite weapon, designed to make me feel small, powerless, and entirely dependent on his family wealth. He genuinely believed that this forged piece of paper was the final nail in my coffin. He thought he had successfully painted me as a desperate, broke, and unhinged woman who was entirely unfit to raise a child. The judge took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The stern pity in her eyes was agonizing to witness. She looked at me with deep, extreme concern. She had spent her entire career protecting children from unstable environments, and right now Bradley's forged documents were telling her a terrifying story. "Miss Natalie," the judge said, her voice heavy with regret. "If these financial records are accurate, I cannot in good conscience allow your son to return to your care today. $500,000 in delinquent debt indicates an environment of extreme instability and potential homelessness. I understand you are claiming the father was abusive in that audio clip, but I must prioritize the immediate physical security of the child. I am dangerously close to signing an emergency temporary custody order, granting physical placement to the father until a full financial investigation can be completed." My lawyer put his face in his hands, letting out a defeated sigh. Bradley sat up straight, ready to celebrate his vicious victory. Sienna reached for her designer purse, preparing to walk out of the courtroom with my son. They thought it was over. But they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside the heavy corporate folder I was still holding in my hands. I stood up from my chair, breaking the heavy, suffocating tension that had settled over the room. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the space. "Before you sign any emergency orders based on those entirely fabricated papers, I formally request permission to take the stand under oath and submit my actual certified financial disclosures." Bradley's attorney immediately jumped up to object, waving his hands frantically, but Judge Ramirez held up her hand to silence him. She was looking at me with a mix of curiosity and intense scrutiny. Given the extreme severity of the allegations, she granted my request without hesitation. I picked up my heavy leather folder and walked confidently across the well of the courtroom. I placed my right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I was looking down directly at my ex-husband. I opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. These were not cheap photocopies or highly manipulated digital prints like the ones Sienna had thrown on the bench. These were official legal papers bearing the raised, embossed seals of the Internal Revenue Service and the undeniable watermarks of one of the largest corporate wealth management banks in the country. I handed the stack to the court bailiff, who immediately carried them up to the judge's towering wooden desk. "The documents Mr. Bradley just presented to this court are a complete and total forgery," I stated, my voice completely unwavering. "He took a small business loan that I co-signed for his failing tech company 7 years ago and maliciously altered the digital headers. He fabricated those collection notices to make it appear as though I am facing personal financial ruin. What the bailiff has just handed you, Your Honor, are my official tax transcripts for the last 5 consecutive years, along with my fully certified corporate asset portfolio." Judge Ramirez slid her reading glasses back down the bridge of her nose. She opened the first heavy folder. The courtroom was so unbelievably quiet that I could actually hear the thick, high-quality paper turning in her hands. I watched her eyes scan the top line of the IRS transcript. She paused, completely freezing in place. She blinked hard and pulled the paper slightly closer to her face, as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Then she quickly flipped to the second page, tracing her finger down a long column of numbers. The severe, deeply concerned expression she had worn just moments before completely vanished, replaced by a look of absolute sheer shock. For the past 3 years since our divorce, I continued keeping my icy gaze locked entirely onto Bradley's face. My ex-husband has loudly and repeatedly told everyone that I am a struggling, unemployed interior stager. He told his wealthy family, his friends, and even his new wife that I rely entirely on his meager child support checks to survive. I allowed him to believe that carefully crafted lie. I allowed his toxic sister to insult my clothing, my home, and my upbringing on Thanksgiving. I did this because his incredibly fragile ego required him to feel superior to me, and because I wanted absolute peace to rebuild my professional life without his constant financial abuse and manipulation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the polished wooden railing of the witness stand. But I do not arrange furniture for a living. I never have. I am the founder, chief executive officer, and 100% shareholder of Apex Commercial Holdings. The name of the company echoed against the mahogany walls like a gunshot. Bradley's high-priced lawyer suddenly stopped shuffling his legal pads. He froze completely, his head snapping up to look at me. He instantly recognized the name. Anyone who operated in the corporate business sector in this city knew that name. We are a private commercial real estate firm, I explained to the court, maintaining my deadly calm demeanor. We acquire, develop, and manage high-value corporate properties across the entire eastern seaboard. I do not have a negative net worth. I am not facing eviction from a low-income apartment. The dilapidated residential address Bradley hired a private investigator to photograph is merely a small empty shell property my firm uses for anonymous mail routing. As those certified banking documents and tax returns clearly confirm, my actual personal net worth is well over $40 million. I can provide for my son in ways my ex-husband could never even begin to comprehend. The entire courtroom went dead silent. It was a heavy, crushing vacuum of sound where no one even dared to breathe. Sienna dropped her designer handbag onto the floor with a loud thud, her jaw literally falling open as she stared at me in pure, unadulterated disbelief. Bradley's attorney sank slowly back down into his chair, looking at his client with the terrifying realization that he had just submitted forged legal documents against a multimillionaire. And Bradley, the arrogant, wealthy heir who had spent the last decade trying to make me feel completely worthless, sat utterly paralyzed at the plaintiff table. The smug, victorious smirk was wiped from his face, replaced by a sickening, pale shade of gray. His worst nightmare had just come true. I was not the weak victim he thought I was. I was the one holding all the power. The absolute silence in the courtroom felt heavy enough to crush bone. Judge Ramirez kept her eyes locked on the official tax transcripts for a long time before she finally looked up. When she turned her gaze toward the plaintiff table, the anger radiating from her was palpable. She looked directly at Bradley's high-priced attorney, who was currently staring at his legal pad like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Counsel," the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You submitted documents to this court claiming the defendant was completely bankrupt. I am currently holding verified federal tax returns proving she is a multimillionaire. Do you have a death wish for your legal career? Or did your client intentionally provide you with fraudulent evidence?" The attorney stood up, completely abandoning his arrogant posture. He stammered, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson. "Your Honor, I assure you I received those financial documents directly from my client just yesterday. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of their fraudulent nature." Bradley realized his own lawyer was immediately throwing him under the bus. Panic finally began to crack through his carefully maintained mask of superiority. He shot up from his chair, waving his hands defensively. "Your Honor." "That is not true," he practically shouted, his voice pitching up in desperation. "Her company must be a scam. It is a shell corporation. I run a legitimate business. I am the founder and chief executive of a highly innovative tech startup. We were just evaluated at $10 million. We occupy the entire 14th floor of the premium glass tower downtown. I have real assets. I provide real security for my son. She just plays around with dirty real estate." I sat perfectly still in the witness box, listening to him brag about his office space. This was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. I looked down at the heavy leather folder resting on my lap. I reached inside and pulled out a single thick document bound with a blue legal ribbon. I waited for Bradley to finish his frantic, desperate bragging before I spoke. "Your Honor," I said, projecting my voice clearly over Bradley's frantic rambling. "My ex-husband is absolutely correct about one very specific detail. He does indeed occupy the entire 14th floor of that premium glass tower downtown. It is a beautiful state-of-the-art commercial space, with floor-to-ceiling windows and sweeping views of the city skyline." I handed the blue-bound document to the bailiff, who immediately walked it over to the judge. What my ex-husband does not realize, however, is who actually owns that beautiful skyline view. I continued watching Bradley's face closely. 8 months ago, Apex Commercial Holdings executed a massive private acquisition of downtown properties. We bought that glass tower in a quiet off-market cash transaction. I am not just a woman he used to belittle and control, I am his commercial landlord. Bradley's jaw literally dropped. He fell backward into his heavy leather chair as if he had been physically shoved. His eyes darted wildly toward his lawyer, begging him to object, begging him to find a loophole, but the lawyer was already reading the copy of the deed of trust with a look of pure defeat. And since Mr. Bradley so graciously brought up the tremendous success of his innovative tech startup, I think it is only fair that this court sees exactly how successful his business truly is, I said, pulling another stack of papers from my folder. I handed a printed financial ledger to the bailiff. This is the official rent ledger for his corporate lease, pulled directly from my accounting department this morning. Judge Ramirez took the ledger and scanned the columns. Her severe expression darkened even further. "As you can clearly see, Your Honor, Mr. Bradley has not paid a single dime of commercial rent in 6 consecutive months." I explained, my voice steady and unyielding. His primary investors pulled their funding last spring when his prototype completely failed. His tech company has 0 incoming revenue, 0 operating capital, and absolutely no legitimate prospects. He is completely drowning in corporate debt. The only reason I did not have my property managers lock him out of the building 5 months ago was because I wanted to see exactly how far he would take this pathetic charade. I reached into my folder one last time and pulled out a bright yellow sheet of paper. This is an official commercial eviction notice signed by my legal department yesterday afternoon. By the time this court adjourns today, his fancy glass office doors will be permanently padlocked. All of his remaining office equipment will be seized to cover his massive unpaid balance. He has absolutely nothing left. The wealthy, arrogant facade Bradley had worn for his entire life shattered into a million unfixable pieces right there in the courtroom. He sat paralyzed, staring blankly at the polished wooden table, unable to form a single coherent word. Beside him, Sienna looked like she was about to be sick. "You told me the company was expanding." Sienna whispered, her voice shaking with absolute horror. "You said we were rich. You said you bought me a diamond tennis bracelet last week." Bradley could not even look at her. He just stared at the floor, breathing heavily. Judge Ramirez dropped the eviction notice onto her desk with a loud slap. "Let me make sure I am fully understanding this situation. Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice dripping with pure judicial disgust, "you came into my courtroom demanding emergency custody of a child, claiming the mother was financially ruined and unstable. You submitted forged banking documents to support your lies. And all the while, you were secretly bankrupt, dodging eviction, and secretly squatting in a commercial building owned entirely by the very woman you were trying to destroy. I looked at my son Leo, who was sitting quietly next to my lawyer. He gave me a small, brave smile. The man who had terrorized us for years was finally completely exposed. The quiet moment between my son and me was violently interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. Sienna could no longer contain herself. The horrifying realization that she was legally tethered to a bankrupt fraud was too much for her superficial mind to process. She shot up from her seat, her designer white dress suddenly looking incredibly out of place. Her face was flushed dark red, and her hands were trembling violently as she pointed a manicured finger directly at me. "She is extorting us!" Sienna shrieked, her voice completely, losing its practiced soft tone and pitching into a desperate, hysterical wail. "She is using her ridiculous real estate money to blackmail my husband. This is revenge. She is just a bitter, jealous ex-wife who cannot stand the fact that Bradley chose a younger, more beautiful woman to build a high-profile life with." Judge Ramirez immediately reached for her gavel, but Sienna was entirely beyond the point of reason. She was caught in a panic spiral, hyperventilating as she desperately tried to convince the room and herself that her luxurious influencer lifestyle was not a complete sham. "He is not broke," Sienna screamed, leaning over the plaintiff table and glaring at the judge. "He is a highly successful tech founder. He provides for me perfectly. She is lying about his accounts. Just last week, he transferred $200,000 directly into my personal business account so I could launch my new luxury skincare line. He buys me thousands of dollars in designer bags for my social media giveaways every single month. We just booked a first-class trip to Milan for Fashion Week. He has plenty of money." The sheer stupidity of her outburst hung in the air like a thick fog. Sienna thought she was defending Bradley's honor and proving his wealth. She genuinely believed that listing off her extravagant recent purchases would somehow invalidate the certified eviction notice and the massive corporate debt I had just presented. She lacked the basic financial literacy to understand what she was actually confessing to on the public court record. Bradley lunged forward and grabbed Sienna's wrist, violently yanking her downward. "Shut your mouth, you absolute idiot!" he hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes wide with pure terror. But the damage was already done. Bradley's expensive attorney did not even try to object. He simply took off his glasses, placed them quietly on the table, and rubbed his temples with both hands. He knew instantly that his client had just crossed the line from civil family court matters straight into federal felony territory. Judge Ramirez slowly lowered her gavel. She did not yell. She did not reprimand Sienna for the outburst. Instead, the judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, predatory focus. She looked at the court reporter who was furiously typing every single word Sienna had just screamed. "Hold on a moment," Judge Ramirez said, her voice slicing through the remaining tension like a razor blade. "Let us unpack what you just shouted to this entire courtroom. You are stating for the official record that Mr. Bradley transferred $200,000 to your personal account last week." "Yes," Sienna spat back, yanking her arm away from Bradley's grip and lifting her chin defiantly. She completely misinterpreted the judge's calm tone as a sign of validation. "Because his startup is thriving. He told me he secured a massive new round of seed funding from his angel investors. He used that investor money to fund my lifestyle brand and buy my promotional designer merchandise. Because he believes in my career, unlike her." Sienna gestured wildly toward me, a smug, triumphant look briefly flashing across her face. She truly thought she had just won the argument. I sat perfectly still in the witness box, watching a federal crime being confessed in real time. Using corporate investor funds meant specifically for tech development to purchase personal luxury goods and fund an unrelated influencer's lifestyle brand was the textbook definition of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Judge Ramirez turned her piercing gaze from Sienna to Bradley. Bradley was staring straight ahead, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. "So let me get this completely straight, Mr. Bradley," the judge said, her tone incredibly calm, but carrying a lethal weight. "You have not paid your commercial rent in 6 months. You have completely defaulted on your corporate leases. Yet, according to your own wife, you are actively taking seed money from your tech investors and funneling it directly into her personal bank accounts to buy designer handbags and first-class plane tickets." Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was completely trapped. The judge looked down at her notes and then back up at the court reporter. "Please highlight that entire admission," the judge instructed clearly. "I will be requesting a full transcript of this specific portion of the hearing immediately following our adjournment today." Sienna's triumphant posture finally began to crumble. She looked at the judge, then at Bradley's terrified pale face, and finally at the attorney who was refusing to make eye contact with either of them. The brutal reality of what she had just done slowly started to register in her eyes. She had not saved her husband. She had just handed the authorities the exact motive and confession they needed to put him in a federal penitentiary. The crushing reality of Sienna's accidental confession had barely settled over the plaintiff table when absolute chaos erupted from the wooden benches in the gallery behind us. Bradley's parents had been sitting there all morning acting like royalty attending a coronation. They had worn their most expensive clothes and carried themselves with a sickening air of superiority, completely expecting to watch their son easily strip me of my child and my dignity. Now their perfect wealthy illusion was going up in flames right in front of their eyes. Bradley's mother suddenly leaped to her feet, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage and denial. The heavy wooden bench creaked loudly as she pushed past her husband, marching toward the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the courtroom floor. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the basic rules of courtroom decorum. "She is a liar," Bradley's mother screamed, her shrill voice echoing violently against the high ceiling. "She is a filthy gold digger. She hacked into our family bank accounts. That is the only way a nobody like her could ever get that kind of money. She stole from my son. She is framing him to steal his company. You cannot listen to this absolute garbage." She gripped the wooden railing, leaning over it as if she wanted to physically attack me. "She has always been jealous of our wealth," the mother continued, shrieking hysterically, completely unable to accept that the woman she had treated like dirt for 10 years was actually a multimillionaire. "Arrest her right now. Arrest her for stealing from my family." Judge Ramirez did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, her voice booming with an authority that instantly commanded the room. "You will shut your mouth and sit down this exact second, or I will have you removed in handcuffs." Bradley's mother froze, but her mouth was still open as if she wanted to argue. Judge Ramirez leaned far over her desk, her eyes burning with absolute fury. "Bailiff," the judge snapped, pointing sharply at the armed officer standing near the door. "Step forward. If that woman utters one more syllable, you will place her under arrest for contempt of court, and you will drag her down to the holding cells. This is a court of law, not a reality television show." The heavy thud of the bailiff's boots walking toward the gallery was enough to finally break the mother's hysterical trance. Bradley's father quickly stood up, grabbing his wife's arm and physically pulling her back down onto the wooden bench. They both shrank back into the shadows, their faces red with profound public humiliation. The untouchable wealthy family had just been threatened with jail time and put firmly in their place. I sat perfectly still in the witness box watching the pathetic display. I did not say a word to defend myself against the mother's wild accusations because I did not have to. The certified banking documents sitting on the judge's desk already proved everything. With the gallery finally silenced, the conflict abruptly shifted back to the plaintiff table. Bradley's expensive attorney was sweating profusely. He was looking at a client who was completely broke and staring down the barrel of a federal fraud investigation. The attorney knew that if Bradley had no money, there would be no way to pay his astronomical legal fees. Desperation makes people incredibly bold, and this lawyer was suddenly very desperate. He frantically unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and began digging through a mountain of paperwork, throwing files aside until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a thick stapled document with a bright yellow legal sticker on the front. "Your Honor," the attorney said, standing up quickly and trying to regain his professional composure. "Let us put the corporate accounting issues aside for a moment, because there is a massive legal oversight happening right now." He held the document up in the air. "This is the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties before their marriage." Bradley's head snapped up. A sudden desperate glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. The attorney walked confidently toward the bench, practically vibrating with renewed energy. According to the financial documents the defendant just submitted, Apex Commercial Holdings was officially incorporated 3 months before the divorce decree was finalized by the state. That means the foundation of this $40 million enterprise was established during the legal marriage. The lawyer turned around and pointed a victorious finger at me. Under the explicit terms of this legally binding prenuptial agreement, any corporate entity or significant financial asset created during the union is subject to an equal division of property. Therefore, my client is legally entitled to exactly 50% of Apex Commercial Holdings. He owns half of her company, Your Honor. Bradley suddenly sat up straight at the table. The color returned to his pale face, and that sickening, arrogant smirk slowly began to creep back onto his lips. He looked at Sienna, who had stopped crying and was now staring at the lawyer with wide, greedy eyes. They both genuinely believed they had just found the ultimate loophole. They thought they were about to walk out of that courtroom with $20 million. Bradley actually laughed out loud. It was a cruel, booming sound that echoed through the courtroom, replacing the heavy silence that had just nearly crushed him. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest with the supreme confidence of a man who had just won the lottery. Beside him, Sienna was practically vibrating with joy. She clasped her hands together and looked up at the ceiling as if thanking a higher power for delivering her from the nightmare of poverty. She was already mentally spending the $20 million she believed they were about to receive. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Natalie?" Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He leaned across the heavy oak table, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at me. "You spent years building up this massive real estate company, hiding it in the shadows, working yourself to the bone, and for what? Just to hand half of it right over to me on a silver platter. I want immediate access to those corporate accounts, Your Honor. I want my 50% stake formally recognized by this court today." His highly paid attorney stood tall beside him, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He smoothed his expensive silk tie and offered the judge a polite professional nod, genuinely believing he had just executed a brilliant legal maneuver that would secure his exorbitant hourly fees. But I did not panic. I did not break down in tears or shout in frustration. I simply sat in the wooden witness box and let out a soft, quiet sigh. I looked over at my own court-appointed lawyer. Earlier in this hearing, he had been sweating through his cheap suit, completely overwhelmed by the aggressive legal team across the aisle. But right now, a slow, genuine smile was spreading across his face. He picked up a slim manila folder from our table and casually stood up. "Not so fast, counselor," my lawyer said, his voice steady and completely devoid of fear. He walked calmly toward the bench, holding the folder in his right hand. "Your Honor, opposing counsel is absolutely correct about the dates of incorporation. The timeline he presented to this court is completely accurate, and the prenuptial agreement he is currently holding was indeed signed by both parties. However, there is a massive glaring omission in his current legal argument." Bradley's victorious smile faltered just a fraction. His attorney frowned, stepping slightly to the side. "What omission?" the attorney demanded sharply. "The contract is ironclad." "It was ironclad," my lawyer corrected him smoothly, "until your client deliberately and secretly voided it exactly 2 years ago." My lawyer handed the manila folder up to Judge Ramirez. "Your Honor, What I have just submitted to the court is a certified federal filing from the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. 2 years ago, Mr. Bradley made a disastrous private investment in a highly volatile foreign commodities market. He lost a tremendous amount of money. He was absolutely terrified that his wealthy parents would find out about his massive financial failure and cut him off completely. So behind his family's back, and without informing his new wife, he filed for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy to wipe out his debts. A loud, sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. I did not even need to look back to know it was Bradley's mother. Her precious, successful son had just been exposed as a massive financial failure right in front of everyone. Bradley jumped to his feet, his face instantly draining of all color. "Shut up!" he yelled at my lawyer. "That document was supposed to be sealed. That has absolutely nothing to do with this family court proceeding." "It has everything to do with this proceeding," Judge Ramirez barked, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down on the sounding block to silence him. "Sit down and let the man finish his statement." My lawyer turned slightly so he could look directly into Bradley's terrified eyes. "When you file for federal bankruptcy, you are legally required to declare every single asset you own and every single potential financial claim you possess under penalty of perjury. When Mr. Bradley filed 2 years ago, he explicitly swore under oath that he had no outstanding claims to any of his ex-wife's assets. If he truly believed he was entitled to half of Apex Commercial Holdings, he was legally obligated to report it to the federal bankruptcy trustee. Because he intentionally hid it, he completely forfeited any right to pursue it now. Bradley's attorney looked like he was about to pass out. He grabbed the edge of the plaintiff table to steady himself, realizing the catastrophic legal hole his client had secretly dug for them both. "But it gets even worse for him," my lawyer continued, turning back to the judge. "If you flip to page 14 of the prenuptial agreement opposing counsel just presented, you will find a standard financial solvency clause. It clearly states that if either party declares personal bankruptcy after the dissolution of the marriage, any future claims to the other parties subsequently matured, business assets are immediately and permanently voided." Judge Ramirez quickly flipped through the prenuptial agreement, running her index finger down the page until she found the exact clause. She read it silently, then looked over at the certified bankruptcy filing. She meticulously matched the names, the dates, and the signatures. The trap was completely shut. There was absolutely no way out for him. The $20 million dream died in a matter of seconds. Sienna let out a high-pitched sobbing sound, burying her face in her hands. She finally realized she was not walking out of this courtroom rich. She was permanently chained to a man who was utterly, completely, and hopelessly broke. Judge Ramirez looked down at Bradley's expensive attorney. "Well, counselor," the judge said, her voice laced with absolute mockery, "it appears your client failed to inform you that he legally torched his own prenuptial agreement 2 years ago. He is not entitled to 50% of anything. He is entitled to absolutely nothing." Bradley collapsed back into his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. The arrogant predator who had dragged me into this courtroom to steal my son and destroy my life was now sitting in the ashes of his own lies, entirely defeated. The silence after the judge's ruling was shattered by a sound I had never expected to hear. Sienna let out a piercing, guttural scream. It was not her usual performative cry for sympathy. It was the raw, terrifying sound of a woman who just realized her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. She turned her entire body toward Bradley, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "You filed for bankruptcy!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "You looked me in the eye when we got married and you told me you were a millionaire. You told me my future was completely secure." Bradley tried to grab her hands, his face a mask of absolute panic. He knew that if Sienna turned on him completely, he had absolutely no one left to defend his fragile ego. "Sienna, please just lower your voice," he begged, glancing nervously up at the judge. "We can fix this together. I have a plan to get the money back. We just need to talk to my parents and figure out a new strategy." But Sienna was completely past the point of rational negotiation. She ripped her hands away from his grasp with such violent force that she knocked over a heavy pitcher of water sitting on the plaintiff table. It shattered against the wooden floorboards, sending sharp glass and ice everywhere. "There is no plan," Sienna screamed, leaning in so close to his face that their noses almost touched. "Your parents cannot save you anymore. You are a complete fraud. You let me sit here and brag about designer bags and expensive European vacations while you knew you were totally broke. You let me confess to federal crimes in front of a judge because you are too much of a coward to admit you are a massive failure." The rage completely consumed her. Sienna balled her manicured hands into tight fists and began hitting Bradley right there in the middle of the solemn courtroom. She struck his shoulder and his chest over and over again, her expensive diamond rings catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. "You ruined my life," she wailed, hitting him harder with every single word. "You used me to play a part in your stupid fake life. You told me she was the crazy one, but you are the absolute psycho." Bradley threw his arms up, trying to shield his face from the barrage of sudden blows. "Stop it right now," he yelled, trying to push her away, but he was entirely too weak to overpower her frantic adrenaline-fueled assault. His highly paid attorney scrambled out of his chair, backing away toward the heavy wooden wall, completely abandoning his client to avoid getting caught in the physical crossfire. The lawyer wanted absolutely nothing to do with this escalating disaster because he knew his legal fees were never going to be paid. Judge Ramirez did not tolerate the violent physical outburst for more than a few seconds. "Bailiffs, separate them immediately," the judge roared, her voice echoing like thunder across the high mahogany ceiling. Two large uniformed court officers sprinted across the well of the courtroom. One officer grabbed Sienna by the waist, physically lifting her off the ground and pulling her firmly away from the plaintiff table. The other officer stepped directly between them, placing a heavy hand on Bradley's chest and forcing him to stay seated in his chair. "Let me go," Sienna screamed, thrashing wildly against the strong grip of the bailiff. Her perfect white designer dress was heavily wrinkled and stained with spilled water from the broken pitcher. Her carefully styled hair was an absolute mess, falling into her tear-streaked face. She looked completely unhinged, a far cry from the polished, elegant influencer who had confidently strutted into the courtroom just 2 hours earlier. "I am filing for divorce, you broke, pathetic loser," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Bradley as the officer dragged her toward the wooden benches on the far side of the room. "I will not go to federal prison for you. I will tell the authorities absolutely everything you did." The united front of the villains was officially completely broken. The team that had marched into this building fully expecting to destroy me and steal my child was now violently eating itself alive. Bradley's parents sat frozen in the gallery, watching their perfect golden son get physically attacked by his perfect new wife. His mother was clutching her chest, breathing heavily, while his father stared at the floor in absolute crushing shame. They could not blame me for this disaster. They could not claim I was the problem anymore. Bradley sat slumped in his chair, his expensive Italian suit rumpled and his tie violently pulled to the side. He was breathing hard, staring blankly at the shattered glass and spilled water on the floorboards. He looked incredibly small and defeated. For the first time in his entirely privileged life, there was no family money to bail him out. There was no clever lie to save his reputation. He was entirely isolated and exposed as a massive financial and moral failure before the law. I sat quietly in the witness box, watching the absolute destruction of my abuser unfold. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sadness. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. The monster who had terrorized me for a decade was finally powerless. But the trial was not over yet, because his desperate sister Caroline was about to make the worst mistake of her entire life to try and save him. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut as the bailiffs escorted a hysterical Sienna out into the marble hallway. The echo of her screaming faded, leaving a stunned, heavy silence in its wake. Judge Ramirez let out a long, exhausted breath and pinched the bridge of her nose. She looked down at Bradley, who was still staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, completely broken and publicly humiliated. I thought the hearing was effectively over. I thought the judge was about to strike her gavel and grant me full custody right then and there so my son and I could finally go home in peace. But the toxic loyalty of his family ran far deeper than I could have ever anticipated. From the second row of the wooden gallery, Caroline suddenly stood up. Her designer silk dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. She looked at her defeated brother, then turned her piercing gaze toward the judge. Her face was set in a mask of desperate determination. "Your Honor," Caroline called out, her voice shaking just enough to sound sympathetic, but loud enough to command immediate attention. "I know I am not formally listed as a witness today, but I am begging you to let me speak. A child's life is in immediate physical danger, and you are not seeing the whole truth here today." Judge Ramirez frowned deeply, her patience clearly running razor thin after the explosive outbursts. "Mom, this is a formal legal proceeding, not an open public forum," the judge warned sternly. "Your family has already wasted this court's time with forged financial documents and admitted corporate fraud. I highly suggest you sit back down and remain silent." "I cannot sit down!" Caroline cried, taking a step toward the wooden railing. She pressed her hand over her heart perfectly, playing the role of the terrified, devoted aunt. "My brother might have made terrible financial mistakes. He might be broke and desperate, but he is a good father. And the woman sitting in that witness box is an absolute monster. I have undeniable proof that she physically abused her son on Thanksgiving and coached him to create that digital recording." The words "physically abused" hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. In family court, those two words are the ultimate weapon. No matter how much financial fraud or perjury had already been exposed, a judge cannot simply ignore a direct allegation of child abuse. Judge Ramirez stopped reaching for her gavel. She looked at Caroline, then looked over at me, and finally at my 11-year-old son. "Come forward and be sworn in." Judge Ramirez ordered, her tone shifting back to cautious judicial neutrality. "But understand this clearly. If you are found to be lying under oath today, you will join your brother in a federal holding cell by sunset." Caroline did not flinch. She confidently walked through the swinging wooden gate, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the absolute truth. She took her seat in the witness box, sitting perfectly straight. She refused to look at me, completely focusing her theatrical performance on the judge. "Tell me exactly what you witnessed," the judge demanded, leaning forward. "On Thanksgiving evening, when Natalie dropped Leo off at our family home, I went outside to speak with her." Caroline began weaving her lie with chilling precision. "I wanted to ask her about Leo's recent behavioral issues, but when I approached her car, I saw it happen. I saw Natalie grab Leo violently by the shoulders and shake him. She was screaming at him, telling him that if he did not record a fake audio clip framing his father, she would lock him in his bedroom for a week without food. She slapped him, Your Honor, right across the face. I felt my blood run completely cold. It takes a special kind of evil to sit in a court of law and invent a story about a mother beating her child." I looked back at the gallery and saw her husband Terrence sitting completely rigid. His hands were clenched into tight fists on his knees, his eyes burning with absolute disgust as he listened to his wife commit blatant, unforgivable perjury. But Caroline was not finished. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "I did not just come here with a story," she said, her voice thick with fake emotion. "I know how serious this is. That is why I immediately took action to protect my nephew." She handed the envelope to the court bailiff. Inside that envelope is a signed, sworn evaluation from Dr. William Arrington, a highly respected, licensed child psychologist. I took Leo to see him privately the day after Thanksgiving. Dr. Arrington spent 2 hours evaluating my nephew. His professional medical conclusion is right there in writing. He states unequivocally that Leo is suffering from severe physical trauma and extreme maternal manipulation. The doctor confirms that Leo confessed to him that his mother forced him to fake that audio recording. The bailiff handed the document up to the judge. Judge Ramirez broke the seal and began reading the official-looking medical letterhead. As her eyes scanned the page, the deep lines of concern returned to her face. A sworn statement from a licensed medical professional was a massive escalation. It was the kind of evidence that could instantly stall my victory and force Leo into the terrifying foster care system while a massive state investigation took place. Bradley slowly lifted his head from the table. A faint spark of hope returned to his dead eyes as he watched the judge reading the psychologist's report. He thought his sister had just saved him. He thought this fake doctor was the silver bullet that would finally destroy me. But as I looked at the signature on that medical report, a slow, cold smile crept back onto my face. Caroline had just made a fatal, catastrophic mistake, and my lawyer was already standing up ready to completely dismantle her fake expert. My lawyer did not even wait for the judge to finish reading the forged psychological evaluation. He stepped directly out from behind our table, holding his own freshly printed stack of papers. Your Honor, I must immediately object to the admission of that document into the official court record. My lawyer said, his voice ringing with absolute confidence. That evaluation is not a medical finding. It is a fabricated piece of fiction, written by a man who is not legally permitted to practice medicine in the state of New York or anywhere else in this country. Caroline gripped the edges of the witness stand, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the solid wood. Her fake expression of maternal concern started to crack instantly. I object to this slander, she snapped, glaring down at my lawyer. Dr. Arrington is a highly respected professional. He has a private practice. He had a private practice, my lawyer corrected her, stepping much closer to the witness box. Past tense. Your Honor, the man who signed that document, William Arrington, was stripped of his medical license exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. My lawyer handed a thick, heavily stamped packet up to the judge's bench. The state medical board revoked his credentials after a lengthy federal investigation revealed he was running a massive insurance fraud scheme, billing patients for hundreds of hours of phantom therapy sessions. He is a convicted felon, currently serving a 5-year probation sentence. Judge Ramirez dropped the fake psychological evaluation onto her desk as if it had suddenly caught fire. She ripped open the packet my lawyer had just handed her and quickly scanned the medical board revocation records. Her eyes darted from the official state seal back to Caroline, who was suddenly looking incredibly small in the witness box. The judge was absolutely furious. Submitting a fake medical document in a child custody case was an unforgivable offense, but my lawyer was nowhere near finished. He turned back to Caroline, holding up a glossy printed photograph. He walked right up to the wooden railing, trapping her under his intense scrutiny. Ms. Caroline, since you just swore under oath that you sought out this man strictly for his highly respected professional medical opinion, perhaps you can explain this photograph to the court today. He turned the photo so the judge and the gallery could clearly see it. It was a picture pulled directly from Caroline's own public social media account. It showed Caroline and the disgraced fake doctor standing together on a pristine green tennis court, holding expensive rackets and laughing over glasses of champagne. The caption beneath the photo read, "Sunday doubles with my favorite partner in crime. You did not take my 11-year-old son to a legitimate medical clinic." My lawyer thundered, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. You took him to your private country club. You sat him down in the dining room with your disgraced tennis partner, and you intimidated a child into remaining silent while your fraudster friend drafted a fake psychological report on a stolen piece of obsolete medical letterhead. Is that not the absolute truth? Caroline opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked wildly around the courtroom, desperate for someone to help her. She looked at Bradley, but he had already buried his face in his hands, knowing she had completely doomed them both. He could not save her. He could not even save himself. She looked at her husband Terrence in the gallery, but he only shook his head in absolute disgust, refusing to meet her pleading eyes. "Answer the question, Ms. Caroline." Judge Ramirez ordered, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register that commanded the entire room. "Did you knowingly submit a fraudulent medical document drafted by an unlicensed felon to this court today? Did you sit in that chair, place your right hand on a Bible, look me in the eye, and commit blatant perjury to manipulate a child custody hearing?" Caroline began to hyperventilate. Her carefully constructed image of high society elegance completely disintegrated under the crushing weight of the law. "I just wanted to help my brother," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Natalie is ruining our family. I had to do something to stop her." William said he still had his old clinic letterhead and nobody would ever bother to check. He said it would be easy to fool the court. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Caroline had just admitted to a massive felony right on the public record. She had openly conspired to present fake medical evidence, and she had lied under oath to a sitting family court judge. Judge Ramirez leaned back in her high leather chair, rubbing her temples. She looked at Caroline with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep, unyielding anger. "You people are truly unbelievable," the judge whispered, shaking her head. "You march into my courtroom, acting like you own the world, and you have done absolutely nothing but lie, forge documents, and commit federal crimes since the moment you sat down. Bailiff, do not let that woman leave this building. When we adjourn today, she is to be taken directly into police custody." Caroline let out a sharp, terrified wail, covering her face with her hands as she finally realized she was going to jail. Bradley was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the heavy wooden table in front of him. Their entire wicked plan was in absolute ruins. The fake evidence was destroyed, the perjury was exposed, and the wealthy, arrogant family was finally facing the severe legal consequences of their actions. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom remained tightly closed. Caroline was sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, as the reality of her impending arrest crashed down upon her. Judge Ramirez was writing fiercely on her legal pad, preparing the official orders to have Caroline taken into police custody and to dismiss the emergency custody petition entirely. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. The fake documents had been exposed, the perjury had been dismantled, and my son was finally safe. I thought the intense legal battle was officially over, and that justice had finally been served. But justice needed one final undeniable voice to completely bury this family's toxic legacy forever. From the second row of the wooden gallery, a tall, imposing figure suddenly stood up. It was Terrence. He calmly unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, his face completely expressionless. For over a decade, Terrence had sat quietly in the shadows, observing the relentless cruelty his wife and her family inflicted upon me. He was a highly intelligent African-American man who had built a lucrative career as a senior corporate consultant, relying on logic and integrity. He had always maintained a tight-lipped diplomatic distance from their dramatic chaos, simply to keep the peace in his own marriage. But today, watching them attempt to steal a child, using a disgraced felon, he had reached his absolute breaking point. "Your Honor," Terrence's deep, steady voice echoed through the massive courtroom, instantly slicing through his wife's frantic, pathetic crying. Caroline whipped her head around. When she saw her husband standing up and stepping out from the wooden benches, her tear-stained face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She knew exactly what he was about to do. "Terrence, no!" Caroline shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate, panicked wail. "What are you doing? Sit back down right now. Please do not say anything." Terrence did not even look at her. He walked right past his wife, treating her as if she were completely invisible. His heavy leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished floorboards as he approached the swinging wooden gate that separated the public gallery from the legal floor. He stopped at the railing and looked directly up at the towering judge's bench. "My name is Terrence. He stated clearly, projecting his voice with absolute authority. I am a senior corporate consultant, and unfortunately, I am currently married to that woman. I formally request permission to be sworn in as a direct witness to these proceedings. Judge Ramirez slowly lowered her pen. She looked at Terrence, taking in his calm, professional demeanor and the sheer gravity in his eyes. It was a staggering contrast to the chaotic, lying mess of the family he had married into. Sir, you are not listed on any of the witness disclosures provided to this court today, the judge noted cautiously. And your wife is currently facing severe criminal charges for blatant perjury. What exactly could you possibly add to this absolute disaster of a hearing? I can add the absolute undeniable truth. Your Honor, Terrence replied, his tone unwavering and firm. I have watched my wife and her brother systematically abuse my sister-in-law for 10 years. I stayed quiet to keep the peace in my own home, which is a profound moral regret I will carry for the rest of my life. But I draw the line at watching them destroy an 11-year-old boy. I was physically present at their family estate on Thanksgiving night. I saw and heard exactly what happened. I can provide direct eyewitness testimony regarding the audio recording Leo played this morning, and I can confirm for the official record exactly who is lying in this room. Bradley suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He shot up from his chair, his face pale and sweating profusely. "Objection!" he yelled, slapping the heavy oak table. "You cannot let him testify. He is completely biased. He hates our family. He is just trying to ruin me." Bradley looked frantically at his expensive lawyer, begging him to intervene. But his attorney simply crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and looked up at the ceiling, completely refusing to engage. The lawyer knew it was entirely over, and he was not going to risk his own law license to save a sinking ship. "Mr. Bradley, your lawyer is smart enough to know when to stop talking," Judge Ramirez snapped, glaring heavily at my ex-husband. "You would be extremely wise to follow his example and sit down before I hold you in contempt." The judge turned her sharp attention back to Terrence. "Given the unprecedented level of fraud, forgery, and perjury your family has already introduced into my courtroom today, I am going to allow this," she ruled firmly. "Bailiff, please swear the gentleman in." Terrence pushed open the swinging wooden gate and walked toward the witness box. As he passed Caroline, she reached out and desperately grabbed his arm, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please do not do this to us," she begged, her expensive makeup running in dark streaks down her face. "You are going to ruin everything." Terrence stopped. He looked down at his wife's desperate, gripping hand. Then he looked her dead in the eye with a gaze so cold it could freeze water. "You ruined everything the moment you brought a fake medical report to a judge to steal a child," he said, his voice completely devoid of any affection or sympathy. He pulled his arm out of her grasp, walked up to the witness stand, and placed his right hand on the Bible, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. The court bailiff held out the worn leather Bible. Terrence placed his large hand firmly upon it, swearing to tell the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He sat down in the wooden witness chair, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. He did not look nervous or intimidated. He looked entirely in his element, commanding the space with a quiet, undeniable power. Judge Ramirez leaned forward, resting her chin on her folded hands. "State your full name and occupation for the record." "Please," the judge requested, her tone noticeably more respectful than it had been with anyone else from his wife's family. "My name is Terrence," he replied, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I am a senior partner at a global corporate consulting firm specializing in high-level mergers and acquisitions. I spend my entire life analyzing complex contracts, verifying corporate facts, and identifying massive financial fraud. I have absolutely nothing to gain by sitting in this chair today. In fact, by testifying against my own wife and my brother-in-law, I am intentionally detonating my own marriage. I will likely be walking out of this building straight into a divorce lawyer's office. But I refuse to sit quietly in the gallery and watch an innocent child be destroyed by a coordinated, cowardly campaign of lies." Judge Ramirez nodded slowly, giving him her full, undivided attention. Please address the testimony your wife just provided regarding the events of Thanksgiving evening. The judge instructed, her pen hovering over her legal pad. Terrence did not even bother to look at Caroline, who was still weeping quietly at the defense table. My wife committed blatant perjury, he stated plainly, without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. I was standing in the grand foyer of the estate the entire time Natalie was dropping off her son. The front door was wide open and the porch light was on. I had a completely clear, unobstructed view of the driveway. Natalie never raised her voice. She never made a single threatening gesture. And she absolutely never laid a hand on her child. She stood there absorbing a barrage of vile classist insults from my wife with more dignity and grace than I have ever seen from anyone in that toxic family. Natalie simply handed over the boy and drove away into the night. The entire narrative my wife just invented about physical abuse and coercion was a complete and absolute fabrication designed solely to manipulate this court. The judge pressed her lips together into a thin, hard line. She wrote a quick, sharp note on her legal pad, her expression hardening into solid stone. And what happened after the mother left the premises, the judge asked, looking back up. Terrence shifted his gaze directly to Bradley. Bradley shrank back into his expensive leather chair, physically recoiling as if he were trying to disappear completely. He could not meet Terrence's intense, burning stare. That is when the real abuse occurred. Terrence testified, his voice dropping into a register of profound, utter disgust. Bradley did not welcome his son with open arms. He marched down the grand staircase, grabbed the boy aggressively by the upper arm, and physically dragged him down the hallway into his private mahogany study. He slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. But the walls of that old historic house are not as soundproof as he arrogantly assumes they are. I followed them down the hallway because I did not like the violent, unhinged look in Bradley's eyes. I stood directly outside that heavy oak door, perfectly still. Terrence paused, making sure every single person in the room was hanging on his next word. I heard every single threat Bradley made, Terrence continued. I heard the boy crying softly. I heard Bradley slam his fist onto his wooden desk to intimidate the child. I heard him tell his 11-year-old son that he would permanently cut off his health insurance. I heard him explicitly threaten to have the bank evict his mother from her apartment. I heard him order the boy to stand in front of a judge and lie under oath, or else they would both starve on the streets. The audio recording that brave child played for this court earlier this morning is 100% authentic. It is not an artificial intelligence deepfake. It is the raw, terrifying reality of a dangerous, abusive father terrorizing his own flesh and blood to serve his own fragile ego. The absolute finality in Terrence's voice completely annihilated whatever tiny shred of doubt remained in the courtroom. He had systematically dismantled every single lie the family had tried to sell. He had validated my silent strength over the past decade and completely vindicated my brave little boy. Bradley looked like a man who had just been hit by a massive freight train. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His highly paid attorney was already quietly sliding his legal pads back into his briefcase, completely abandoning the case and mentally calculating how fast he could exit the building. I thought Terrence had just delivered the final decisive blow to end this nightmare once and for all. But as he looked back up at the judge, his dark eyes narrowed slightly. He was not finished destroying them yet. Terrence remained perfectly still in the witness chair, allowing the crushing weight of his testimony to settle over the courtroom. Bradley was breathing in short, ragged gasps, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, as if he were calculating his chances of making a run for it. Judge Ramirez finished writing her notes on the legal pad and let out a long, heavy sigh. She looked at Terrence with profound respect, clearly preparing to dismiss him from the stand and close the hearing. But Terrence did not move to stand up. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence once again. "I am not completely finished. Custody and abuse are only half the reason this man dragged my sister-in-law into this courtroom today. The other half is purely financial, and I have the evidence to prove it. Terrence pulled his hand from his pocket and held up a small, heavy silver flash drive. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the metallic surface, making it gleam. Bradley's eyes locked onto that tiny device, and all the remaining blood instantly drained from his face. He let out a strange, choked sound, a pathetic whimper of absolute defeat. Exactly 1 month ago, Terrence continued, looking directly at the judge. Bradley came to my corporate office unannounced. He was sweating, shaking, and completely desperate. He told me that his tech startup was facing a routine financial audit from his angel investors, and he needed a massive favor. Because I am married to his sister, he arrogantly assumed that family loyalty meant I would gladly compromise my own professional integrity to save his skin. He demanded that I look at his corporate ledgers and clean them up before the investors could see the massive holes in his accounting. Terrence lowered his hand and placed the silver flash drive onto the wooden railing of the witness stand. I agreed to conduct the audit, Terrence said, his tone turning incredibly sharp. But I did not clean up his mess. I dug straight to the bottom of it. Because when I look at financial records, I do not just see numbers, I see exactly where the money goes. And what I found hidden beneath layers of fake vendor invoices and shell corporations was staggering. The court bailiff stepped forward, picking up the silver flash drive and carrying it up to the towering wooden desk. Judge Ramirez took the device, holding it carefully between her fingers as if it were a loaded weapon. That drive contains the complete, unedited financial architecture of Bradley's fraud, Terrence testified, projecting his voice so the court reporter would not miss a single syllable. But the most damning files on that drive have absolutely nothing to do with his failing tech startup. They have to do with his divorce from Natalie 3 years ago. During the dissolution of their marriage, Bradley swore under oath to this very court that he possessed no liquid assets and could therefore only afford to pay the absolute bare minimum in child support. Terrence turned his head slowly, locking his dark, furious eyes onto his brother-in-law. That was a massive documented lie, Terrence stated. The drive you are holding, Your Honor, contains irrefutable proof that in the 6 months leading up to his divorce, Bradley systematically liquidated hundreds of thousands of dollars in shared marital assets. He intentionally funneled that money into 3 separate offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. He starved his own child and financially abused his ex-wife while sitting on a hidden fortune. Bradley shot up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the floorboards with a loud crash. "You stole my private property!" he screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at Terrence. "That was a confidential consultation. You signed a non-disclosure agreement. You cannot use that against me in a court of law." Terrence's expression did not change. He did not even blink at the outburst. "I am a licensed corporate officer and an officer of the court," Terrence replied, his voice drowning out Bradley's pathetic screaming. "The moment I discovered you were actively committing federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and perjury, my non-disclosure agreement became entirely null and void under the law. I do not aid and abet criminals, especially not abusive cowards who threaten children. Sit down right now, Mr. Bradley." Judge Ramirez roared, grabbing her gavel and slamming it down with terrifying force. The bailiff immediately rushed forward, grabbing Bradley by the shoulders and forcefully shoving him back down into his seat. Bradley's highly paid attorney, who had been completely silent during this entire exchange, simply stood up, picked up his heavy leather chair, and physically moved it 3 feet away from his client. He wanted to make it abundantly clear to the judge that he was entirely separating himself from the walking felony sitting next to him. Judge Ramirez placed the silver flash drive gently onto her desk, right next to the forged financial documents Bradley had submitted earlier that morning. She looked at Terrence and gave him a slow, solemn nod of gratitude. "You have done a tremendous service to this court today, sir," she said quietly. I sat in my own chair, watching the man who had tormented me for years finally face the absolute destruction of his entire life. The financial trap he had built to destroy me had completely reversed and swallowed him whole. But as Terrence remained on the stand, the information on that drive was about to claim one more unexpected victim. Your Honor. Terrence said, his voice breaking the brief moment of silence that had settled over the room following Bradley's outburst. There is one specific folder on that drive I strongly advise you to open immediately. It is labeled with the exact name of the luxury lifestyle brand the plaintiff's current wife was bragging about just a short while ago. Judge Ramirez plugged the silver flash drive into her secure judicial terminal on the bench. Her eyes scanned the screen as she navigated through the digital files Terrence had meticulously organized. As I audited the tech startup's financial ledgers, Terrence explained, maintaining his calm clinical tone, I noticed a massive discrepancy in their operating expenses. Bradley was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in initial seed money, money explicitly provided by his angel investors for software development, and routing it through a complex web of dummy marketing contracts. Those contracts were entirely fake. They were designed specifically to funnel the stolen corporate capital directly into a single limited liability company. Terrence pointed toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom where Sienna had been escorted out earlier. That limited liability company is registered entirely in Sienna's name, Terrence stated. Bradley used her influencer brand as a completely unregulated shell corporation. He laundered the stolen investor money by classifying the illegal transfers as brand sponsorships and private business grants. And because Sienna is the sole proprietor of that company, she is the one who legally signed the banking agreements. She is the one whose name is on the fraudulent tax returns. Judge Ramirez stopped scrolling. The glowing light from her computer monitor illuminated the absolute severity on her face. She looked up and locked eyes with the bailiff standing near the back of the room. Officer, the judge commanded sharply, go out into the hallway and bring that woman back inside my courtroom immediately. The bailiff nodded, opening the heavy wooden doors and disappearing into the marble corridor. A few moments later, he returned, practically dragging Sienna back into the room. She looked absolutely miserable. Her expensive white designer dress was still stained with water. Her makeup was completely ruined and she was clutching her expensive handbag like a life preserver. She walked back to the plaintiff table, keeping a wide distance from Bradley, who was still staring blankly at the floor. Sienna assumed she was being brought back inside to finalize the destruction of her marriage. She had no idea she was walking right into a federal trap. Step forward and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Judge Ramirez ordered, pointing a pen directly at Sienna. Your husband did not just lie to you about being wealthy, he actively used you to commit massive corporate crimes. Sienna froze. Her red-rimmed eyes darted wildly between the judge and Terrence. What are you talking about? She stammered, her voice trembling. I did not do anything. I just run a lifestyle blog. You run a money laundering operation. The judge corrected her in a cold, unyielding tone. This court has just been provided with undeniable digital proof that your personal business was used to wash hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen investor capital. Your signature is on the incorporation documents. Your name is on the fraudulent bank accounts. When you stood in this courtroom earlier today and proudly confessed to receiving massive financial transfers to fund your European vacations and buy designer handbags, you were openly admitting to receiving stolen property. Sienna's jaw dropped. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked like she might faint right there on the spot. I did not know, she gasped, taking a desperate step backward. He just handed me paperwork and told me to sign it. He told me it was for taxes. I do not know anything about corporate finance. I swear I did not know the money was stolen. Willful ignorance is not a valid legal defense against federal wire fraud, Judge Ramirez fired back mercilessly. You gladly spent the money. You flaunted the stolen wealth. You enjoyed the absolute privilege of that stolen cash while sitting in my courtroom and trying to help this man steal a child from a hard-working mother. You are not a victim in this scenario. You are a legally documented accomplice. The sheer gravity of the word accomplice struck Sienna with the force of a physical blow. The delusion of her glamorous life completely shattered. She was not going to walk away from Bradley and easily find another wealthy man to fund her superficial lifestyle. She was going to be indicted. She was going to be investigated by federal agents. She was facing years in a federal penitentiary. Sienna let out a sharp, ragged gasp as her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily into the wooden chair beside the plaintiff table. Her hands flew to her chest and she began to hyperventilate violently, pulling in quick, shallow breaths that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Her designer handbag slipped from her fingers, hitting the floorboards and spilling expensive cosmetics everywhere. She grabbed her own hair, rocking back and forth in absolute terror. Bradley did not even look at her. He just sat there completely numb, trapped in his own impending doom. The arrogant, wealthy couple who had tried to destroy my family was now reduced to a pair of broken, trembling criminals waiting for the authorities to arrive. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Sienna continued to quietly hyperventilate in her chair. Bradley remained perfectly still for a few long, agonizing seconds. He stared at the polished floorboards as if he could simply will himself to disappear. The entire wealthy, arrogant life he had built on a foundation of lies was completely gone. He was no longer the brilliant tech entrepreneur he loved to pretend to be. He was a broke, exposed fraud staring down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. And then something inside him finally snapped. The transition was instantaneous and terrifying. The charming, well-educated persona Bradley had carefully maintained for his entire life completely evaporated. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His skin flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He slowly turned his head away from his broken wife and locked his manic, bloodshot eyes directly onto Terrence. Terrence was still sitting calmly in the witness box, watching the destruction unfold with a stoic, unwavering expression. That quiet, dignified strength was the exact thing that pushed Bradley entirely over the edge. "You ruined me!" Bradley roared, his voice tearing through the quiet courtroom with a raw, animalistic fury. Before anyone could even react, Bradley violently shoved his heavy oak chair backward. It crashed to the floor with a deafening thud. He lunged away from the plaintiff table, completely ignoring the judge, the lawyers, and the armed officers. He charged straight across the well of the courtroom, directly toward the witness box where Terrence was sitting. Bradley did not just yell, he completely lost his mind. As he sprinted toward the wooden railing, he unleashed a torrent of pure venom. He screamed a string of vile, horrific racial slurs that echoed violently off the high mahogany ceiling. It was a disgusting display of the deep-seated bigotry his family had always harbored, but had cowardly kept hidden behind closed doors. He threatened to kill Terrence. He threatened to destroy his entire life, screaming that a man like Terrence had absolutely no right to take down a family like his. Terrence did not flinch. He did not cower or raise his hands to defend himself. He simply stood up from the witness chair, his massive frame towering over the wooden railing, looking down at the charging, pathetic man with absolute stone-cold contempt. Terrence knew Bradley was a coward who only preyed on women and children, and he was not intimidated in the slightest. But Bradley never even reached the witness box. The two armed court bailiffs, who had been standing on high alert, moved with lightning speed. The older officer intercepted Bradley just inches away from the swinging wooden gate. He grabbed Bradley's expensive suit jacket, twisting the fabric, and violently yanking him backward off balance. The second officer, a massive, heavily built man, charged in from the side. He wrapped his thick arms directly around Bradley's waist, tackling him with the full force of his body weight. The impact was brutal and loud. Bradley hit the solid wooden floorboards with a sickening crack. The breath was completely knocked out of his lungs, stopping his vile, racist screaming instantly. The two large officers descended on him, pressing their heavy knees firmly into his back and shoulders. "Get your hands behind your back right now!" The larger bailiff bellowed, his voice easily overpowering Bradley's desperate grunts of pain. "Stop resisting or I will deploy my taser." Bradley thrashed wildly against the polished wood, trying to kick his legs and twist his body away from the crushing weight. He was completely feral, driven by pure panic and rage. But he was no match for the highly trained officers. They swiftly grabbed his flailing arms, pulling them painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Judge Ramirez had shot up from her heavy leather chair the moment Bradley charged. She stood behind her towering bench, her hands planted firmly on the desktop, looking down at the absolute chaos unfolding on her courtroom floor. Her face was a portrait of profound judicial disgust. She had presided over family court for decades, but this level of unhinged violent bigotry and corporate fraud was entirely unprecedented. Sienna was sobbing hysterically, cowering in her chair with her hands covering her face, completely traumatized by the monster she had married. My lawyer instinctively stepped in front of me to shield me and my son from the violence, but I gently pushed his arm away. I wanted to see this. I wanted Leo to see this. I wanted my brave 11-year-old boy to watch the man who had terrorized him for his entire life get physically pinned to the ground and locked in steel chains. Bradley finally stopped thrashing. His cheek was pressed hard against the cold floorboards, his expensive suit torn and covered in dust. He lay there panting heavily, completely humiliated in front of the judge, the lawyers, and his own family. The wealthy, arrogant predator had finally been reduced to exactly what he truly was, which was a pathetic, violent criminal who had absolutely nowhere left to run. The two massive court bailiffs hauled Bradley up from the polished floorboards. His designer suit was torn at the shoulder, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. They forced him back into his heavy leather chair at the plaintiff table, leaving his hands secured tightly behind his back, in cold steel handcuffs. One bailiff stood directly behind him, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder to ensure he did not move another inch. The sickening sound of Bradley's heavy, ragged breathing filled the otherwise completely silent courtroom. He was no longer a wealthy tech founder or an arrogant bully. He was just a pathetic, broken man waiting for his final, inevitable judgment. Order had been violently restored, but the heavy tension in the room was still suffocating. Judge Ramirez stood tall behind her massive wooden bench. She did not sit down. She looked out over the courtroom, her piercing brown eyes scanning the absolute wreckage of the family that had dared to insult the integrity of her court. When she finally spoke, her voice did not echo with loud, frantic anger. It was dangerously quiet, carrying a lethal, chilling authority that demanded absolute, unblinking obedience from every single person in the room. Mr. Bradley, Judge Ramirez began her words, slicing through the dead air like a sharpened blade. I have sat on this bench for nearly 30 years. I have presided over thousands of complex family disputes. I have seen bitter divorces, angry spouses, and tragic misunderstandings. But I have never in my entire judicial career witnessed such a profound, deeply coordinated display of pure malicious evil. She picked up the forged financial documents he had submitted earlier that morning. She held them up for a brief second before dropping them into a nearby metal wastebasket with a loud, dismissive thud. You walked into my courtroom today believing you were completely untouchable. The judge continued, her gaze locked onto his terrified, sweating face. You believed that, because you come from generational wealth, you could simply buy your way to custody and crush anyone who stood in your way. You forged federal banking documents to frame an innocent woman. You committed blatant perjury right in front of my face. You colluded with your sister to produce a fraudulent medical report from a convicted felon. You laundered stolen corporate funds through your new wife's vanity business to fund your lavish vacations. And worst of all, you psychologically tortured your own 11-year-old son, threatening to starve him simply to feed your massive, fragile ego. Bradley kept his eyes glued to the scuffed floorboards, entirely unable to look the judge in the face. His parents sitting in the gallery behind him were completely silent, their heads bowed in absolute crushing shame. The family name they prized above all else was now permanently stained with multiple federal felonies. Judge Ramirez then turned her attention away from the plaintiff table and looked directly at me. The harsh, severe lines on her face softened into an expression of profound, undeniable respect. Ms. Natalie, the judge, said, her voice warming slightly, but still projecting with immense authority. For 3 years, you have endured a ruthless campaign of financial abuse and emotional terrorism that would have completely broken most people. Your ex-husband and his family mocked you at every turn. They called you worthless. They tried to strip away your dignity, your career, and your child. But you did not scream. You did not retaliate with illegal tactics or stoop to their vile level. You simply put your head down, built a $40 million commercial real estate empire in complete silence, and allowed their own arrogant stupidity to completely destroy them. That requires a level of intelligence, grace, and silent strength that this man could never even begin to comprehend. I nodded slowly, feeling a heavy, suffocating knot in my chest finally begin to untangle. I squeezed Leo's hand gently, feeling his small fingers grip mine back. Then Judge Ramirez looked down at my son. She offered him a kind, deeply reassuring smile that completely contrasted with the fierce wrath she had just unleashed on his father. Leo, the judge said, leaning forward, resting her hands on the polished wood. It is incredibly terrifying to stand up to a bully. It is even more terrifying when that bully happens to be your own father. When he locked you in that dark study on Thanksgiving night, he thought he had you completely trapped. He thought you were just a scared little boy who would blindly do whatever he commanded. But you were smarter than him. You were much braver than him. By pressing that record button on your phone, you did not just protect your mother. You protected yourself. You showed more integrity, courage, and character in one single night than your entire paternal family has shown in their entire lives. You never have to be afraid of that man ever again. Leo sat up a little straighter in his wooden chair. A small, proud smile touched his lips, and I saw the immense relief washing over him. For the first time in his young life, the heavy, toxic shadow his father had cast over him was entirely gone. Judge Ramirez stood completely straight again, her black judicial robe falling perfectly into place. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. The time for testimony and dramatic revelations was officially over. The brutal public dismantling of Bradley's lies was entirely complete. It was time for the final legal hammer to fall and permanently sever this highly toxic family from our lives forever. Judge Ramirez picked up her heavy silver pen and pulled a fresh stack of official court orders toward the center of her desk. The entire room held its collective breath. Even the court reporter seemed to type quieter, completely mesmerized by the absolute finality radiating from the bench. Based on the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence presented in this courtroom today, Judge Ramirez announced, her voice projecting with absolute legal certainty, "I am issuing an immediate and permanent ruling on this emergency petition. Mr. Bradley, your request for physical and legal custody of the minor child is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, due to the severe documented psychological abuse you inflicted upon your son and the massive fraudulent schemes you orchestrated, I am stripping you of all parental rights, effective this exact second. You will have 0 physical custody. You will have 0 legal custody. You will have absolutely no visitation rights of any kind, supervised or otherwise." Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, his handcuffed arms pulling awkwardly against his shoulders. He did not argue. He had absolutely nothing left to fight with. "I am granting full sole legal and physical custody to the mother, Natalie." The judge continued, signing the first document with a swift, heavy stroke of her pen. She has demonstrated exceptional stability, profound emotional maturity, and absolute financial independence. She is the only parent in this room fit to raise a child. I let out a shaky breath, squeezing Leo's hand. We had won. The dark cloud that had hovered over us for a decade was finally lifting. I looked down at my son and saw tears of pure relief welling up in his bright, intelligent eyes. He leaned his head against my arm, knowing he was finally truly safe. But Judge Ramirez was far from finished. In addition to the custody ruling, the judge stated, picking up a second thick legal document, "I am hereby granting a 5-year permanent restraining order to protect Natalie and her son. This order legally prohibits you, Mr. Bradley, from coming within 1,000 feet of your ex-wife, your son, her residence, her place of business, and the child's school. And because the toxic behavior in this case was a deeply coordinated family effort, this restraining order extends fully to your current wife, Sienna, and your sister, Caroline. A sharp gasp echoed from the hallway doors where Caroline was being detained, but the judge completely ignored it. If any of you attempt to contact Natalie or her son by phone, by email, through third parties, or in person, you will be immediately arrested and jailed without bail. The judge warned, her eyes sweeping across the broken family. You are to permanently erase their existence from your lives. Do you understand me? Bradley gave a weak, pathetic nod, his chin touching his chest. Finally, the judge turned her attention to the court clerk sitting quietly to her left. She picked up the small silver flash drive Terrence had provided, along with the forged bank records and the fake medical evaluation. She placed them all into a heavy manila envelope and sealed it firmly. Madam Clerk, Judge Ramirez, instructed, handing the sealed package down. I want you to officially stamp these items into evidence. The moment we adjourn today, you are to draft an urgent judicial referral. You will immediately forward the contents of this envelope directly to the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Bradley's highly paid attorney visibly winced. Sending a judicial referral directly from a sitting family court judge meant the federal agencies would not just review the case. They would immediately prioritize it. You will inform the federal authorities that this court has received direct testimony and digital evidence confirming massive offshore tax evasion, corporate wire fraud, and the intentional laundering of stolen investor capital, the judge commanded. You will also include the official court transcript of Sienna's full verbal confession to receiving those stolen funds. Sienna let out another ragged sob, burying her face against the heavy wooden table. She was officially the primary target of a federal criminal probe, and finally the judge said, looking directly at the bailiff holding Bradley's shoulder, "You will contact the local district attorney's office. Inform them that I am formally recommending immediate felony perjury charges against Caroline and forgery charges against Mr. Bradley. I want arrest warrants drafted before the sun goes down today." Judge Ramirez stacked her papers neatly, bringing perfect order to the absolute chaos she had just untangled. She looked down at Bradley one last time. "You came into my courtroom trying to use the law as a weapon to destroy an innocent mother," the judge said, her voice dropping to a harsh, chilling whisper. "But the law does not belong to you. You are dismissed from my court, but you are not dismissed from the consequences of your actions. May the federal authorities show you exactly as much mercy as you showed your own son." Judge Ramirez raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block. The sharp, loud crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, signaling the absolute end of Bradley's reign of terror. This hearing is officially adjourned. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the chaotic energy that had been contained inside finally spilled out into the sprawling marble hallway of the courthouse. I remained seated at the defense table for just a moment longer, holding my son's hand, simply letting the profound reality of our absolute victory wash over me. My lawyer began packing his briefcase with a satisfied smile, but outside in the corridor, the nightmare for my ex-husband's family was just reaching its absolute crescendo. Sienna had been allowed to leave the courtroom first, but she did not run for the exit. She was pacing furiously back and forth near the elevators, her heels clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. When the two massive bailiffs finally pushed through the double doors, physically escorting a handcuffed Bradley out into the public hallway, Sienna stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes locked onto the broken man she had married, and any remaining shred of the delicate, loving wife persona completely evaporated. Bradley looked up at her, his face pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "Sienna, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically as the officers paused to wait for the elevator. "We can hire a criminal defense attorney. We can figure a way out of this. You just need to stick to the story and tell the feds you knew nothing about the corporate accounts." Sienna let out a laugh so harsh and completely devoid of sanity that it echoed down the entire length of the corridor. "Stick to the story," she shrieked, taking a step toward him. Her face was flushed dark red with pure unadulterated rage. You want me to go down with your sinking ship while you sit in a federal prison cell? You lied to me about your wealth. You used my name to launder stolen money. You just lost your own child and you legally destroyed your entire family in less than 3 hours. I am not sticking to anything. Sienna reached down and violently grabbed her left hand. She gripped the massive 2-carat diamond engagement ring Bradley had bought her using stolen investor funds and yanked it off her finger. With a scream of absolute disgust, she threw the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Bradley's chest. The ring hit his torn suit jacket and bounced off, clattering loudly against the hard marble floor and rolling away into a corner. I am filing for an immediate annulment, Sienna yelled, pointing a shaking manicured finger right in his face. I am calling my own lawyer right now, and I am taking a plea deal. I will tell the Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely everything they want to know. I will give them your passwords, your hidden bank account numbers, and every single fake vendor contract you ever made me sign. I will personally hand them the keys to your prison cell if it keeps me from doing time for your pathetic financial crimes. Bradley physically recoiled as if she had slapped him. The ultimate betrayal from the woman he had chosen over me completely broke whatever tiny fraction of his spirit remained. You greedy, ungrateful brat, he hissed, struggling against the heavy steel handcuffs. I gave you that lifestyle. You were a nobody before you met me. That is enough. The larger bailiff barked, shoving Bradley forward as the elevator doors finally slid open with a soft chime. You can save the domestic disputes for the county jail. Move inside right now. The courthouse police officers who had been summoned to assist with the transport stepped forward, completely surrounding Bradley. They grabbed him roughly by the shoulders and forced him into the crowded elevator. Bradley did not fight them this time. All the violent rage that had possessed him inside the courtroom was completely gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization that his life as a free, wealthy man was officially over. He looked out through the closing elevator doors, his eyes searching desperately for anyone to save him. He looked at his parents, who were standing frozen near the courtroom entrance, completely unwilling to step forward and intervene. And then his eyes met mine as I walked out into the hallway with Leo. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a smug smile or a final parting insult. I simply looked at him with the cold, distant indifference he truly deserved. The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off his panicked face and taking him down to the basement holding cells to be processed for his violent courtroom assault and multiple federal felony charges. Sienna did not even watch him go. She immediately pulled out her smartphone, her hands shaking violently as she frantically dialed a number to hire a criminal defense attorney. She turned her back on her former in-laws and practically sprinted down the hallway toward the exit, leaving her fake diamond ring sitting completely forgotten in the dust on the courthouse floor. The villains were violently turning on each other, completely consumed by the massive legal inferno they had started themselves. As Sienna disappeared down the long corridor, the heavy silence of the courthouse hallway returned. But the destruction was not entirely finished. I stood near the heavy wooden doors, holding Leo's hand, preparing to finally walk out of this building and into our new life. Before we could even take a step toward the exit, a pathetic, desperate sobbing echoed from the other side of the hallway. It was Caroline. She was being escorted out of the courtroom by a female court officer who was gripping her upper arm firmly. The judge had ordered her arrest for felony perjury, and the reality of a jail cell was completely destroying her carefully maintained high society facade. Caroline dragged her feet, her expensive designer heels scuffing against the polished marble floor. Her face was an absolute disaster of ruined makeup and uncontrollable tears. When she looked up and saw Terrence standing near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, her entire body heaved with a violent, desperate sob. She yanked her arm, trying to pull away from the officer. "Please let me talk to my husband," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Just give me 1 minute, please. I need to speak to my husband." The court officer glanced at Terrence. Terrence gave a short, slow nod, indicating he was willing to entertain this final conversation. The officer released Caroline's arm, but took a firm step closer, making it abundantly clear that Caroline was not going anywhere except the county jail. Caroline practically threw herself at Terrence. She reached out with both hands, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, burying her tear-stained face against his chest. "Terrence, please, you have to fix this," Caroline wept, staining his expensive suit with her tears. "You know all the best defense attorneys. You have to call them right now. You have to bail me out. I cannot go to jail, Terrence. I cannot survive in a place like that. You know I only did it for my brother. I only lied for family. You have to understand that. We are family." Terrence did not wrap his arms around her. He did not offer a single word of comfort or try to wipe the tears from her face. He stood completely rigid, his hands resting casually at his sides, allowing her to desperately cling to him. When she finally looked up at him, hoping to find a shred of the love and protection he had provided for the last 10 years, she found absolutely nothing. His dark eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "You did not lie for family, Caroline," Terrence said, his voice completely flat and terrifyingly calm. "You lied because you are a cruel, arrogant woman who believes the rules do not apply to you. You sat in that witness box and tried to destroy a completely innocent mother and her child. You proudly handed a forged medical document to a sitting judge. You showed the entire world exactly who you are, and I am thoroughly disgusted that I ever allowed myself to be associated with you." Caroline gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands fell away from his jacket. "But I am your wife," she stammered, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. "You took vows. You promised to stand by me." Terrence slowly reached down and unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. He opened the polished brass clasps and reached inside. "I promised to stand by a partner," Terrence corrected her, maintaining his icy, authoritative tone. "I never promised to anchor my life to a convicted felon, and I absolutely never promised to remain tethered to a family of vile, unrepentant bigots. I have sat quietly at your parents' dinner table for 10 years, listening to the subtle racist remarks, the classist jokes, and the endless toxic superiority you all share. I stayed because I mistakenly believed you were different from them. Today you proved you are exactly like them." Terrence pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He held it out, extending his arm until the envelope was pressed directly against Caroline's chest. She instinctively raised her shaking hands to take it. "What is this?" Caroline whispered, her eyes wide with terror, staring down at the heavy envelope. "Those are divorce papers," Terrence stated, his voice echoing clearly against the marble walls, ensuring everyone in the hallway heard him. "I had my legal team draft them the moment I found out about the fake psychological evaluation. I have already signed them. My attorneys will be contacting the jail to arrange for your signature. Do not ever call my phone again. Do not ask my firm for financial assistance. You are entirely on your own." Caroline's legs completely gave out. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the hard courthouse floor, clutching the manila envelope to her chest, as she let out a harrowing, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything: her freedom, her marriage, her wealth, and her completely unearned social status. Terrence did not look down at her. He snapped his briefcase shut, turned his back on the crying woman, and walked away. He passed me and Leo, offering us a polite, respectful nod, before continuing down the corridor and pushing through the heavy glass exit doors. The female court officer reached down, grabbing Caroline by the shoulders and pulling her roughly back onto her feet. "It is time to go," the officer stated firmly, dragging the hysterical, weeping woman toward the holding elevators. The absolute destruction of Bradley's family was now completely irreversible. The heavy glass exit doors were just a few dozen yards away at the end of the long marble corridor. After watching Terrence deliver the final devastating blow to Caroline, my son, and I turned our backs on the chaos and walked toward the main elevator bank. The air in the courthouse hallway finally felt light and breathable. I looked down at Leo, who was holding my hand tightly. His small shoulders finally relaxed after years of carrying the heavy burden of his father's expectations. We were seconds away from stepping into the elevator and leaving this horrific chapter of our lives behind us forever. But as I reached out to press the glowing call button, two figures stepped out from the alcove near the restrooms, completely blocking our path. It was Bradley's parents. Just 3 days ago on Thanksgiving evening, these were the same two people who had stood in their grand foyer swirling expensive wine in their crystal glasses while their daughter handed me a fake custody petition. They had laughed at my expense. They had spent a decade treating me like a stray dog that had wandered onto their pristine manicured lawn. Earlier this very morning, they had sat in the courtroom gallery, dripping in designer clothing, acting like untouchable royalty, while they waited for the judge to legally steal my child. Now, however, the arrogant royal facade was entirely gone. They looked incredibly small, fragile, and suddenly very old. Bradley's mother took a hesitant step forward, wringing her hands together nervously. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair had fallen flat against her face. She forced a sickeningly sweet, wavering smile onto her lips, a smile that looked completely unnatural on a woman who had only ever scowled at me. "Natalie, sweetheart." Bradley's mother began, her voice dripping with a fake syrupy affection that made my stomach turn. "Please, just wait a moment, dear. We need to talk to you. Just family to family." I did not pull my hand away from the elevator button. I simply turned my head and stared at her, completely unimpressed by the desperate performance. "We are just so utterly shocked by what happened in there," Bradley's father chimed in, stepping up beside his wife and offering a pathetic groveling nod. "We had absolutely no idea Bradley was involved in those terrible financial things. And Caroline, well, we simply do not know what she was thinking with that awful fake medical report. They made their own terrible choices, Natalie. But you have to know that we always supported you. We always knew you were a strong, capable mother." The sheer audacity of their lie was almost comical. They were actively throwing their own children under the bus just to save face and maintain their connection to my newly revealed wealth. Bradley's mother took another small step closer, reaching her hand out as if she wanted to touch my arm. "Please, Natalie," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes that I knew were entirely manufactured for my benefit. "Bradley and Caroline are facing their own consequences, but Leo is our only grandson. He is our blood. We cannot lose him too. Thanksgiving is not over yet. Let us take him for the weekend just like we planned. Let us spoil him and show him how much his grandparents love him. We can put all this messy legal business behind us and just be a family." Leo instinctively took a step back, hiding slightly behind my leg. He did not want to go with them. He knew exactly how toxic they were. I slowly lowered my hand from the wall and pressed the illuminated down button for the elevator. A soft chime echoed in the hallway, signaling that the car was on its way. I turned my full attention to the two desperate hypocrites standing in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult their appearance or scream at them for the decade of psychological torture they had put me through. I just smiled. It was a deadly calm, terrifying smile that completely froze the fake, hopeful expressions on their faces. "You seem to be suffering from a severe misunderstanding of what just happened in that courtroom," I said, my voice smooth and cold as ice. "The judge did not just strip your son of his parental rights. She issued a 5-year permanent restraining order to protect us from the coordinated abuse of your entire family, and in the eyes of the law, that legal boundary absolutely includes the two of you." Bradley's mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. "But we are his grandparents," she whispered frantically. "You cannot legally keep us away from him." "I can, and I absolutely will," I replied, stepping slightly closer to them, forcing them to cower back against the marble wall. "You are not his family. You are the people who watched him get dragged into a locked study to be terrorized, and you did not lift a single finger to stop it because your precious country club reputation was more important than his safety. You have absolutely zero rights to my son. The elevator doors slid open behind me with a quiet mechanical hum. I guided Leo inside, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Bradley's parents. If either of you ever attempt to contact me, I warned them stepping backward into the elevator car. If you ever try to call his phone, send a letter to my house, or come within 500 feet of my son, I will not just call the police and have you arrested for violating a federal court order. I will use a fraction of my corporate wealth to completely buy out the mortgages in your exclusive gated community. I will personally purchase your precious elite country club, and I will bulldoze it to the ground to build a low-income commercial strip mall. I will ensure that you lose every single ounce of the social standing you worship so deeply. Do not ever test me. Bradley's mother let out a tiny, terrified whimper, clutching her husband's arm as he stared at me in absolute paralyzed fear. They knew I had the money to do exactly what I promised. They knew I was not making an idle threat. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, I said, my voice echoing in the small space. The heavy stainless steel doors slowly slid shut, completely cutting off their horrified faces and severing our ties to their toxic bloodline forever. The descent in the elevator felt like waking up from a decade-long nightmare. As the digital floor numbers softly chimed, counting down to the lobby, the heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for years completely vanished. I looked down at Leo. He was staring at the polished metal doors, his small chest rising and falling in steady, rhythmic breaths. He did not look scared anymore. The constant nervous energy that used to radiate from him whenever his father was near had entirely evaporated. We stepped out into the expansive marble lobby of the courthouse, walking past the metal detectors and the armed security guards. I pushed open the heavy glass exit doors, and we stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The crisp autumn air hit my face, feeling incredibly pure and clean. The city was bustling all around us. Yellow taxis blared their horns, business professionals hurried down the sidewalks with their coffee cups, and tourists pointed at the towering skyscrapers. It was just a normal Tuesday for the rest of the world, but for us, it was the absolute beginning of a brand new existence. The stark contrast between the dark, toxic courtroom we had just left and the vibrant living city in front of us was breathtaking. For years, I had meticulously built my corporate real estate firm in absolute secrecy, terrified that Bradley would find out and use his family wealth to steal it from me. I had hidden my success and my power to keep the peace. But standing here in the bright daylight, I realized I never had to hide ever again. We walked down the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, moving away from the imposing stone pillars and the heavy legal architecture. I guided Leo toward a quiet, sunlit plaza just off the main sidewalk, surrounded by tall maple trees shedding their bright orange and golden leaves. We stopped near a small stone fountain. The sound of the rushing water masked the heavy noise of the city traffic. I let go of his hand and knelt down so I was completely eye level with him. Leo looked at me, his bright, intelligent eyes searching my face for any lingering signs of danger. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but incredibly steady. "Are we finally safe? Is he really gone forever?" I reached out and gently rested my hands on his shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart." I promised, my voice thick with absolute certainty and overwhelming love. "We are completely safe. The judge made sure he can never come near us again. He cannot call you, he cannot threaten you, and he cannot force you to go to that awful house ever again. We are entirely free." Leo let out a long, trembling breath and suddenly wrapped his arms tightly around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder. I hugged him back fiercely, closing my eyes and resting my cheek against his soft hair. It was the first time in years I did not have to worry about looking over my shoulder or preparing for the next vicious legal attack. The crushing anxiety that had lived in my stomach for a decade was permanently erased. I pulled back just enough to look him directly in the eyes. I need you to know something incredibly important, Leo. I told him, making sure he heard every single word. What you did last night took more courage than most grown men will ever possess in their entire lives. You were locked in a room with a bully who wanted to terrify you into submission. But you did not break. You fought back using the absolute truth. You saved yourself, and you saved me today. I am so incredibly proud of you. A genuine bright smile finally broke across Leo's face. He wiped a single stray tear from his cheek, standing up a little taller. As we stood there soaking in the warmth of the afternoon sun, I heard the steady rhythm of footsteps approaching on the concrete pathway. I turned and saw Terrence walking toward the parking garage. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned the top of his tailored shirt, looking completely exhausted but profoundly relieved. The heavy burden of his toxic marriage was officially off his shoulders. Terrence slowed his pace as he noticed us standing by the fountain. He did not walk over to intrude on our private moment, but he stopped for a brief second. He looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting a deep shared understanding of what we had both just survived. Then he shifted his gaze down to Leo. "You are a very brave young man, Leo," Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute respect. "Do not ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Take good care of your mother." Leo nodded politely. "Thank you, sir," he replied. Terrence looked back up at me. He did not offer any empty platitudes or dramatic goodbyes. He simply gave me a warm, genuine smile and a firm nod of mutual respect. It was the silent acknowledgement of two survivors who had successfully burned down a corrupt empire and walked out of the ashes completely intact. I returned his nod, watching him turn and walk away toward his car, leaving the toxic legacy of his former in-laws permanently behind him. I stood up and took Leo's hand once again. The air felt lighter, the sun felt warmer, and the future was entirely ours to write. We just had one final piece of business to take care of before we could truly celebrate. We stood together near the small stone fountain for a few more minutes, letting the cool, crisp autumn breeze wash away the last lingering shadows of the morning. The heavy, suffocating energy of the courthouse was entirely behind us now. As we watched the water cascade over the stones, a massive, completely blacked-out luxury SUV pulled smoothly up to the curb just a few yards away. The heavy tires crunched softly against the fallen golden leaves. My private driver, a kind, distinguished older man named Harrison, immediately stepped out of the vehicle. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the heavy armored door for us, offering a warm, professional smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Natalie," Harrison said, his voice a comforting, deep rumble. "Good afternoon, Leo. I trust the legal proceedings went exactly as planned today." "They went absolutely perfectly," I replied, guiding my son toward the waiting vehicle. "We are officially finished here. You can take us home." Leo climbed into the spacious, immaculate leather interior, and I slid into the seat right next to him. The heavy doors clicked shut instantly, silencing the loud, chaotic noise of the busy city outside. For the past 3 years, I had forced myself to play a highly calculated, dangerous game of chess. I had intentionally driven a rusted 10-year-old rental sedan. I had used a tiny rundown apartment in a bad neighborhood as an anonymous mailing address. I had allowed my ex-husband, his arrogant new wife, and his vicious, toxic family to believe I was completely destitute and struggling to survive. I did it to protect my corporate assets and to ensure my peace of mind while I built my real estate empire in the shadows. But as I settled into the plush, heated leather seat, I knew I never had to pretend again. The mask was permanently off. As Harrison pulled smoothly away from the curb and merged into the bustling downtown traffic, my cell phone began to vibrate inside my tote bag. I pulled it out and looked at the caller identification. It was David, the senior acquisitions manager at Apex Commercial Holdings. I swiped the screen and answered the call, putting it on speaker so my hands were free to hold my son. "Good afternoon, Natalie," David said, his voice crisp and highly professional, echoing clearly through the quiet cabin of the luxury vehicle. "I apologize for interrupting your afternoon, but I wanted to personally update you on the situation at the downtown commercial tower. Our legal department just received the official confirmation from the courthouse clerk. The emergency custody petition has been fully dismissed, and the permanent restraining orders have been legally finalized. Excellent work, David, I said, leaning back against the comfortable leather headrest. And what is the current status of the 14th floor? The eviction team is currently standing by in the main lobby of the glass tower, David confirmed, checking his logistics reports. We have property managers, private security contractors, and a full commercial moving crew ready to move. Bradley's tech startup has been basically empty for weeks, but there is still a massive amount of luxury office equipment inside. We are simply waiting for your final executive order to proceed. I looked out the dark, tinted window of the SUV, watching the towering skyscrapers of the city roll past. Somewhere in one of those massive buildings, Bradley's empty, fraudulent tech company was sitting in the dark, completely out of money and out of time. Meanwhile, Bradley himself was currently sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell in the basement of the courthouse, finally realizing that everything he had ever bragged about was completely destroyed. Execute the eviction immediately, David. He commanded, my voice completely cold, resolute, and unwavering. Padlock the main double doors. Terminate all of their keycard access to the corporate elevators and the private parking garage. Seize every single piece of office equipment, all the high-end computers, the luxury furniture, and the server racks, to cover his massive unpaid rent balance. If there is anyone still lingering in that office, have private security escort them out of the building immediately. Leave absolutely nothing behind. Understood completely, David replied without hesitation. The locks will be changed, and the assets will be fully seized within the hour. Congratulations on a total victory today, Natalie. Enjoy your weekend with your son. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. The ultimate sweet revenge was finally complete. I had not just defeated my abuser in a courtroom. I had legally and systematically dismantled his entire fraudulent empire, stripped away his fake wealth, exposed his massive financial crimes to the federal authorities, and secured absolute, unquestionable freedom for my child. I turned to look at Leo. He was staring out the window, watching the beautiful city skyline, with a look of pure, unbothered peace on his face. I reached over and gently took his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. He squeezed my hand tightly, resting his head against my shoulder as the luxury SUV carried us away from the darkest chapter of our lives. We were heading back to our real home, a sprawling, secure, multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the water, where no one would ever be able to hurt us, belittle us, or threaten us again. We had walked through the fire of an incredibly toxic family, and we had emerged stronger, wealthier, and completely independent. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic situation and rebuild your entire life from the ground up? Have you ever let a bully underestimate you only to prove them completely wrong in the absolutely most satisfying way possible? I would love to hear your stories of resilience and triumph in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of strength and survival. Thank you so much for listening, and remember that your true worth is never determined by those who are completely blind to your value. The most profound lesson we can draw from this entire story is the absolute power of silent resilience over loud arrogance. Throughout the ordeal, the toxic family relied entirely on intimidation volume and fabricated reality to exert control over someone they viewed as inferior. They fundamentally confused silence with weakness. Because Natalie did not scream, cry, or constantly defend herself against their vile insults, they arrogantly assumed she was completely broken and powerless. But her silence was never surrender. It was highly calculated, strategic preparation. We often feel an overwhelming urge to immediately defend our character when we are falsely accused or deeply underestimated by the toxic people around us. Our first instinct is to argue back to match their loud anger, or to desperately prove our worth to those who are stubbornly determined to misunderstand us. However, this story teaches us that the most devastating response to a bully is not a screaming match. The ultimate defense is putting your head down, doing the hard, quiet work, and building a personal and financial foundation so incredibly strong that their lies simply shatter against it. Natalie did not need to convince her abusers that she was successful or capable. She simply gathered her undeniable evidence, built her massive real estate empire in the shadows, and waited for the perfect moment to let the absolute truth speak for itself. Her journey reminds us that true power does not need to constantly announce its presence. It simply arrives when the time is right and completely changes the game. Your value is never determined by the volume of your critics or the cruelty of their opinions. If you are currently dealing with people who constantly underestimate your potential, stop trying to convince them with your words and start showing them with your undeniable success.